Hey guys, welcome back to Pocket Saga, as you've seen in title and thumbnail. In this video we are going to see, what if Ash has Dratini as starter Pokemon? This is part 1, and story is new so I will slowly updates parts as author update more. For more comment down your thoughts and like share, also don't forget to check out author of this story named, Flight to Destiny by Inferno02. All details in description. Ash breathed a deep, long puff of air as he gazed at the entrance of Professor Oak's lab. His heart raced at the rate of knots, his stomach tingling in anticipation. Today was the day. Today he would get his trainer's license, allowing him to travel around, catching and battling with Pokemon. The day that he'd looked forward to his entire life had finally come. He'd turned 13 not long back, and he'd have done anything to start his Pokemon journey as soon as he did. After all, it was at that age that one qualified to get a trainer's license. He'd been so anxious the night before that he found it difficult to sleep a wink. And even after he did, he tried numerous methods which he'd never even thought of before, even going as far as counting Mareep. He was awake well before dawn. Long before today, Ash had decided on his starter. Bulbasaur was amazing in its evolved form, Venusaur was a sturdy battler. It was a popular choice amongst starting trainers. Squirtle turned into a tank that could shatter the defenses of most Pokemon with ease, Blastoise. Yet Ash wished for neither of those as his very first Pokemon. His starter had to be a Charmander. How he dreamed of owning a ferocious Charizard for as long as he understood even the tiniest fundamentals of Pokemon battles. Each time he watched a Charizard in action on TV, adrenaline pumped through him. He awed at the power a Charizard could display with ease. One day, he assured himself every time, one day, he'd have his own and conquer battles the world over with his very own Charizard. After what felt like an eternity, Ash strode forward. He wore a red jacket and dark blue jeans and sported a red hat to top it off. Restraining the urge to barge into the two-story lab, Ash rang the bell. Seconds passed with no answer, his breathing hitched to a crawl. Heat rushed across his neck as his heart hammered in his chest, for he'd waited his entire childhood for this moment. Dreaming of the day he'd take the first steps of his journey. Everything was within reach, and the moments of silence that followed left him breathless. A few arduous seconds later, the door opened and a young woman dressed like a researcher greeted Ash. "Oh, Ash," she smiled at him and Ash returned it with frantic vigor. Good morning, Ms. Cecile." Cecile glanced at her watch and arched an eyebrow. "You sure are early today. Couldn't wait to get your starter." Ash scratched his forehead but kept the grin. "Would you believe me if I said no? Gotten quite sharp, have we now?" Cecile leaned forward and pinched Ash's cheeks playfully. He grimaced through his smile, feeling the urge to shove her hand, but knew she was just playing around with him, so resisted it. She was one of Professor Oak's assistants and he'd known her for years. "Come on inside," she chimed as she finally let go of Ash's cheek. Ash rubbed the spot where she'd pinched him, a little too RSH for his liking, but the slight pain vanished hearing her next words. "The professor's already here. He's got the starters ready too." Cecile motioned for him to follow as she turned around. Again, Ash fought the temptation to leap through the lab, and quietly trailed after her. Soon, he stood at the door of the main hall of the lab. "There's the professor," Cecile beamed, tapping him on the head. She had a habit of messing his already messy hair up, but he had his new hat to thank for being saved from that this time. "Best of luck, Ash." "Thanks, Cecile," Ash boomed as the young researcher waved at him before disappearing into a nearby room. Ash walked inside the room, feeling his stomach do things that he could hardly describe, and greeted the white-haired Pokemon researcher. "Good morning, Professor." Professor Oak appeared so preoccupied with taking notes while gazing into one of the many machines that the lab housed that he hadn't noticed Ash. The words snapped him though, as he turned around and his lips curled up. "Good morning, Ash, my boy," he said, placing the notepad on the desk and walking towards Ash. "Are you ready to get your first Pokemon?" "You bet I am." He grinned and the professor returned it. "I can't believe you kids are already at that age." Professor Oak's eyes narrowed, glittering as if lost in cherished memories from a distant past. "Time flies these days." A dominating presence entered the room, walking behind Professor Oak. Ash's grin turned to awe as he watched the man walk closer. Goosebumps unsheathed from his skin and chills ran down his spine. His breath stolen by the sheer magnificence of the figure that the man was. What was he doing here? Ash's heart raced even faster than it already did. What perfect timing, Ash. The man smirked as he strode forward, each step making his presence even more dominant. He settled barely a few steps from Ash, but towered over him in more ways than one. Lance, Ash mumbled in disbelief. His shoulders stiffened. He didn't expect the champion himself to be present on the day he was supposed to receive his first Pokémon. As the sole leader of the Elite Four of Kanto and Johto, Lance was a man of the highest stature. Ash had known Lance, he'd known the champion for a few years now. He recalled just how excited he'd felt when he'd talked to Lance for the first time. His nerves had almost gotten the better of him at that point. And it had taken him a while to comprehend that he was actually meeting one of his idols. "It's been a while, Ash," the man with red hair said, snapping Ash out of his stupor. The gentle breeze from a nearby window fluttered Lance's cape magnificently behind his back, and Ash found himself awed by everything about him. Ash thought capes to be nothing more than adornments for children. Anyone who wore them asked to be laughed at, but with Lance, everything was worth idolizing. "I was just waiting for you to arrive." Ash's eyes widened even more, if that was at all possible. Was this real? The champion himself was waiting for him. What was the reason? Ash's thoughts wildly marauded into millions of questions that he couldn't find answers for. He'd demand those answers if he could. Ash shook his head and snapped himself out of his stupor, as difficult as it was. "Waiting for me." The champion grinned at him, a fiery gaze honing into Ash's amber eyes. "The professor told me that you were going to choose a Charmander as your first Pokémon." Ash nodded, at which Lance stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. Ash almost shivered at the contact but hid the feeling well. "I am sorry, Ash." Ash frowned at the apologetic tone, Lance's hand gripping his shoulder more firmly. "I was supposed to provide the Charmander to Professor Oak today, but sadly." At what Lance was apparently pointing at, Ash's jaw slackened. His eyes stalked and his body shuddered. Silence invaded the room for the next few moments before he eventually gathered the courage to ask if what he thought was true. He violently shoved the thoughts out of his mind, unwilling to believe it. "Do you," he faltered and could no longer stop himself from shivering. "Do you mean that there's no Charmander for me?" Ash's gaze remained fixated at Lance, practically demanding a reply. His arms hurled themselves wide, and his insides screamed for the champion to deny his claims. However, that reply never came. Lance shook his head, his grim eyes unmoving from Ash's gaze. Ash couldn't believe it. Lance had ruined his perfect day. His Charmander, the one which he had planned to conquer the world with, was not here. His shoulders stiffened at first, then slumped in defeat as his gaze disappointingly moved from Lance to the floor. He hadn't expected this to happen in his worst nightmares. Why couldn't this be one? He'd just wake up and realize that he's still in his bed and he's going to start his journey today, right? Then, he'd get his Charmander from Professor Oak. Exactly as planned. But that wasn't the case. No matter what he tried to tell himself, he knew this wasn't a nightmare. This was reality. A truly brutal one. Eventually, Ash calmed himself. His breathing normalized, his racing heart pulling back speed. However, this wasn't because he'd come to terms with what had happened. He was devastated. As Lance placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, Ash glanced back at him with eyes as dead as a fish. Lance's expression changed. Ash had seen this expression before. He'd seen the champion wear the same intense, blazing look in his most fierce battles. Lance removed a Pokeball from his pocket. "I am sorry, Ash," he spoke in a low voice, his own disappointment seeped through his apology. "I couldn't get you a Charmander, but I have another Pokemon that you might like." Ash looked at him absent-mindedly. He didn't nod, didn't move his body in the least. He considered Bulbasaur and Squirtle to be great Pokemon. But the one he wanted was a Charmander, he Pokemon which would turn into a terrifying dragon. Nothing but a Charmander would do for him. Lance narrowed his eyes at the lack of response. "It's a Pokemon that is just as good as a Charmander," his words brought Ash no relief. Eventually, Ash picked up his shoulders and faced Lance, although he still sulked, his heart barren as an empty shell. "The Pokemon that I have here is a Dratini." At the mention of the name of the Pokemon, Ash's lifeless face lit back to life. He gasped audibly, blinking several times. Had he heard right? A Dratini, he hollered. His heart raced again and his blood pumped so hard that he felt it could gush out at any moment. Instead of a Charmander, he had the choice of getting a Dratini. A Dratini that would turn into a Dragonite, the Pokémon considered to be Lance's strongest. His mind could hardly control itself as it veered into the various possibilities that opened themselves if he was to have a Dragonite. A Dratini wasn't a Charmander, but a Dragonite was just as awesome as a Charizard. Dragonite were considered to be almost mythical, such was the rarity of their sightings, especially in the wild. Ash wouldn't have dreamed that he could get one. Not as his starter anyway. If owning an intimidating Charizard was his wish, owning a majestic Dragonite was something that had never crossed his wildest dreams. "I want the Dratini," Ash declared, excitement in his voice. He pumped his arms with clenched fists, almost lunging at Lance. His spirits flew higher than ever before as he awaited Lance's response with breathless zest. "Then that's what you'll get." Lance grinned and raised the Pokeball in his hand. The red light from the Pokeball shone through, and on the table materialized a blue serpentine Pokémon. The Dratini roared its arrival. Its gaze observing its surroundings before its eyes settled on Ash, its glare as piercing as sharp glass. "That really is a Dratini," Ash exclaimed. This was real. "Yes, that's now your Dratini," Lance chuckled. Ash's cheeks flushed when realization dawned that he'd been too obvious with his little show of excitement. Lance glanced at the Dratini briefly, then frowned. "But that Dratini is somewhat different to a normal one," he warned with a stern gaze. "Different?" Ash asked, a brow cocked. "What do you mean?" "As you probably know, Dratini are generally very calm Pokémon," the Dragon Master said solemnly. "But this Dratini is very aggressive." Just as Lance had finished speaking, Dratini launched a greenish-blue breath of draconic energy. The dragon breath whizzed past Ash by mere centimeters. The accompanying current brushing Ash's hair, a frightening shiver driving down his entire being. It vehemently pelted into one of the machines in the room, and Ash didn't need to look at poor machine to know what had happened, but he still did. To say the Dratini's reckless attack destroyed it would have been an understatement. The round machine, whose functions Ash had no clue about, cackled with electricity. And a hole gaped where the dragon breath had struck. "Hey!" Professor Oak, who'd been listening to the conversation between Ash and Lance until then, roared. "What are you doing letting it out in my lab like this?" Lance. His raised eyebrows and stomp on the floor was enough to show his anger. Ash rarely saw the professor agitated at anything, and this was one of the rare times it had happened. The man loved his lab though, so this shouldn't have been a surprise. Lance sported a sheepish smirk as he sighed. He tapped the Dratini on its head with the Pokeball. "You see Ash." He turned back to Ash and offered him the Pokeball. "This is the kind of trouble this Dratini can cause. Do you still want it?" From the corner of his eye, Ash even saw the professor dismiss his rage and look at him. Not to mention, Lance's eyes glittered as he grinned, which Ash returned. Were they possibly thinking that he wouldn't accept this Dratini after he'd seen its unruly nature? Not a chance. Ash wanted this Dratini. Now more than ever. Once he'd seen what it could do, its power was obvious and it chilled Ash down to the very core. "That's one heck of a Pokémon. I definitely want it." "A Dragonite," he remarked in his head. That was the Pokémon he wanted now. Lance was all too eager, and happy, to hand Dratini's Pokeball to Ash. "I am looking forward to what you can do with this Dratini." Ash grasped his starter's Pokeball. "I'll do my best," he grinned. He hadn't realized this until now, but he'd been calm once he'd seen Dratini. Excited, yes, but controlled. "Thanks." Lance nodded as he tapped Ash's shoulder again. Ash waited for the champion to move his hand before he turned to look at Professor Oak. "My Pokédex, Professor." Patience was becoming increasingly difficult for Ash to muster. He could barely wait to take his first steps as a licensed Pokémon trainer. The professor glanced at the destroyed machine and sighed. Soon enough though, he wore a warm smile again. He opened a drawer and removed a flat, red-colored device alongside several Pokeballs and placed them on the desk. "Here's your Pokédex. Not only will it provide you with information on Pokémon, but it will also give you detailed information about the Pokémon you've captured, like the moves they know and what their ability is. It also acts as your trainer identification," he explained as Ash took the Pokédex and examined it for a second. This was all standard information that he already knew, partly due to the professor having drilled them into his head. This was probably standard protocol before giving them to new trainers. When Ash nodded, Oak continued. And here are some Pokeballs. Without another thought, Ash grabbed the shrunken Pokeballs from the desk after he'd kept his Pokédex in his pocket. Thanks for these. He gripped the belt of his backpack before turning to Lance. I won't disappoint you, Lance. I will train Dratini well. I am sure you will, Lance beamed. I believe in you, Ash. Unsure of the truth those words held but happy enough to soak in the praise, Ash smirked at him. He had gotten the tiniest bit more comfortable in Lance's presence. Ash waved the champion and then at the professor before walking off the room and towards the exit of Professor Oak's lab. Bye, Professor. Aren't you going to wait for your friends? Professor Oak's eyebrows tilted. They'll be here soon. Ash shook his head with a smile. I already met everyone yesterday. His face saddened a touch briefly. He desperately wanted to be with his friends, but that would make it even harder for him to say goodbye. Sadness would overwhelm him and that emotion had no room before his long-awaited journey. He knew his friends would meet him someday. I'm sure I'll come across them soon, anyway, he said. Boasting a grin. He absolutely hoped it would happen. Professor Oak shrugged but smiled soon enough. If that's what you want. Take care, Ash. A trainer's journey can be difficult at times. But don't let it affect you. Ash was glad to know that the professor seemed so worried about him, but he'd rather not trouble the Oak. I will, Professor, he declared confidently, and Professor Oak nodded. He turned to look at Lance. Bye, Lance. Good luck, Ash, Lance smiled. I'm eager to see how far you'll come the next time we meet. The burden of those words weighed heavily on Ash's shoulders. His body tingled for a moment, then calmed itself. He waved at the champion and turned around. He felt better with each stride through the hallway and eventually, outside the lab. He was finally a Pokemon trainer. The calm breeze of Pallet Town gently caressed Ash's face, his shirt fluttering as he stood on the edge of the town he called home. He gazed at the board Y.CH pointed forward and read Route 1 for more than a few minutes. The path that connected Pallet Town to Viridian City, which wasn't that far away, had plenty of wild Pokemon, especially numerous in THOs that would be perfect for a new trainer. He'd been through the road more times than he could count and the Pidgey, Spearow, Rattata, Mankey amongst other Pokemon were a common sight. Excitement surged through his bones at the mere thought of fighting and catching Pokemon with his Dratini. Ash winced when images of his home filled his thoughts. He desperately wanted to head home and hug his mother one last time before he left. But he understood the importance of self-control. No matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't let memories of home distract him. He turned to gaze at his hometown on last time before he began his trek towards Viridian. The floral aroma intoxicated him, and he lazed in the sweet familiar scent of the flowers, trees and meadows. He allowed his eyes to drowse in slow, easy flaps. The morning jogs, the evening strolls, the picnics that he so often had with his friends, Ash would miss those. But the lingering familiarities of home paled to his exuberance which conquered it. And just like that, Ash Ketchum had begun his journey to be the best with his Pokemon. He'd begun his journey to fulfill his lifelong dream. He'd begun his journey to become a Pokemon master. Ash took a bite of the sandwich his mom packed for him as he slumped against a tall dark brown oak tree. He glanced around, the long dirt road his only companion in sight for miles, and sighed. He'd done that a lot today. After beginning his journey with more excitement than he could handle, he began to grow tired. Sleep allured him like a siren. The occasional Spearow, Pidgey or Rattata aside, he'd hardly encountered any noteworthy Pokemon that interested him. He'd walked for no more than a few hours and taken a break once his body began to tire under the scorching summer heat. He gazed at the only Pokeball clipped on his Pokeball belt intently. He hadn't let Dratini out yet. Its fearsome display in Professor Oak's lab had Ash wary before letting out the fierce dragon. If Dratini didn't hold back in the presence of a dragon master such as Lance, he barely stood a chance of controlling it. However, he'd made up his mind to get to know his starter. He wanted to do it right now. He brushed off all the hesitation that clouded him and raised the Pokeball. In a flash of bright scarlet energy, his Dratini materialized in front of him. Its intense glare made Ash flinch. Taming this one wasn't going to be easy. Dratini took a quick look around its surroundings, its fiery gaze scanning almost every inch of the land and the trees around them, and once it had made sure that nothing around was of interest. It curled its long frame, resting its head on top. Its form seemed relaxed, it hadn't given Ash a moment of its attention apart from an initial glance that hardly lasted a second. Well, at least it was calmer than last time. Ash didn't dare disturb the dragon. Not right now anyway. However, this was a great chance for him to get information about his Dratini. He quickly removed his Pokédex from his pocket and scanned Dratini. The Pokédex instantly began to speak. Dratini, the dragon Pokémon. Dratini sheds its skin as it grows, often doing so while hidden behind large powerful waterfalls. This Dratini is male. Its ability is shed skin. Its moves are Dragon Breath, Wrap, Aqua Jet, Leer and Shock Wave. Dratini's moveset had Ash impressed. He couldn't resist a wild grin at the prospect of his starter already knowing moves such as Shock Wave and Aqua Jet. Dragon Breath aside, those two moves provided substantial type coverage which would allow Ash to form a multitude of strategies focused around them. In simpler battles, those moves would do more damage to Pokémon which Dragon-type moves weren't effective against. While Ash stared at his Dratini with feverish elation, its eyes snapped open and a cold glare pierced through Ash. Ash's grin plummeted into a wince at what was to come. "Don't!" Ash cried as draconic energy collected inside Dratini's mouth. "Damn it! Not now!" he screamed, frantically shielding his face as his mind turned bereft of any ideas to resolve the predicament. Dragon Breath wasn't something Ash could simply take head-on. Its raw power had been enough to decimate that machine in Professor Oak's lab, and he feared for himself even more when the images of the scene blistered through his head. However, as he braced himself, the Dragon Breath simply passed by him. In not too dissimilar a way that it had in the lab. In fact, he'd barely felt the air current. Ash steadily opened his eyes and looked through the opening between his fingers. Dratini appeared to have calmed himself down, as he'd gone back to rest. He frowned, then turned around to find an injured Rattata quivering in pain. He grimaced at the sight, but the faintest thread of satisfaction brushed his heart. Dratini had simply tried to keep the rat away from him. But that feeling was fleeting, and he didn't waste a mere moment before he swiftly pulled out a potion from his backpack and sprayed it around the wounded Rattata. He winced at the cry from Rattata. He didn't enjoy Pokémon in pain even if they weren't his. He picked it up carefully and placed it gently against the tree. His features brightening when Rattata's eyes squinted open. He sighed in relief of not just the Rattata being okay, but also at the fact that Dratini hadn't already started to hate him. He'd feared that might have been the case when Dratini had launched his Dragon Breath. "You'll be as good as new in a while," he mumbled before he turned towards his starter. "Hey Dratini," he called softly, stepping closer to the dragon. Careful enough to not startle the beast. "You shouldn't just attack any Pokémon like that." Doubts still lingered in his mind, but he fought past them and Eventu. Ally brought himself to pet the little dragon on the head. And, to his pleasant surprise, Dratini didn't retort. His eyes opened, which made Ash uneasy for a moment, but his gaze wasn't as deadly as before. As Ash caressed the skin on his head more and more comfortably, Dratini shrieked the faintest of coos, apparently enjoying the feeling. However, as soon as Ash chuckled, Dratini shut his eyes viciously and his head whirled the other way. He shoved Ash's hand away with his tail and the lash hurt more than a little. Was the little mighty dragon just trying to act tough? Ash snickered at the thought. Maybe. Getting to know Dratini wouldn't be as challenging as he'd imagined. The rest of the day had gone by without incident. He'd come across a few starting trainers but had restrained the urge to challenge them. As the sky turned a repulsant shade of orange, bringing with it many caws and hoots of Pokémon returning to their nests, a clash of distant shadows snatched Ash's attention. He jogged in its direction and in his view came an orange-haired girl standing against a young boy. Neither of them looked any older than him. He recognized the girl's victorious starfish-like Pock. Emin as a Staryu while the fainted Pokémon on the boy's side was a Mankey. Ash strode towards them and by the time he arrived, the boy had already left. "Hey there," he called, getting the girl's attention. "Wanna battle?" He hadn't come across anyone with a Staryu yet, so he looked forward to a battle with the water type. It might prove to be a decent opponent for Dratini's first bout. The orange-haired girl observed Ash for a moment before she raised her Pokeball. Sure, she grinned. But I warn you, I am strong. You'll just be heading to the Pokemon Center like that boy just now did. Ash rolled his eyes and smirked a moment later. We'll see about that, won't we? This girl didn't have any idea what she was up against. Ash's excitement surged as he raised his Pokeball in front of him, and so did the girl. The Pokemon that came out of the girl's Pokeball was the one she'd used in her earlier match, a Staryu. In the flash of light, Dratini materialized on the ground. He shrieked at Staryu dangerously and looked away immediately, unimpressed. He screeched a few more times. It almost seemed as if he was warning the water type not to mess with him or the consequences would be deadly. That wasn't too difficult to conclude. Not for Ash anyway. Ash raised an eyebrow snidely. Still think you'd beat me that easily? The girl's jaw dropped. You have a Dratini, she exclaimed. She probably didn't expect a trainer on Route 1 to own a Dratini. So many experienced trainers searched for one but not many succeeded. How did you get that? He's my starter, Ash stated confidently, his grin widening by the second. Shall we begin? She blinked a few more times before she shook herself out of her stupor. She nodded and gave an order. Misty calls water gun. What calls? Ash Ned at the unusual order by the girl but soon rolled his eyes. Shock wave. While Dratini laid on the ground without a care in the world, Staryu pointed its topmost limb at the serpent, and out of it, a stream of water rippled at Dratini. The dragon opened his eyes once he sensed the attack and slid to the left as the water gun slipped past him without posing a threat. Damn, Ash cursed as he slapped his forehead. He'd been afraid of this. He had a bad feeling that Dratini might ignore his orders in a battle. So, you can't control it, huh? Misty sniggered cockily. She grinned as her left hand settled on her hips. Now Psywave. Dodge and use Shock Wave, Dratini, Ash said, more in hope than anything. Light blue wisps of energy weaved and outlined Staryu's body. The sheen soaked from its limbs down to its red core. Gentle pulses from the core almost allured Ash into feeling okay, but he bit his lip, bracing himself in the eye before the storm. The orb flashed brighter and fired pulsing rings of Arctic psychic energy towards Dratini. The Psywave smashed into Dratini, who hadn't even tried to evade the move, taking it head-on instead. Blemishes flourished across his blue skin, but he didn't flinch. His glare viciously burned with rage as it fixed on Staryu. Ash grimaced and pursed his lips. Ignoring his orders was one thing, but Ash's dismay was more because Dratini was hit and injured. Dratini could make quick work of Misty's Staryu if he wanted to. It was distinctly evident from its water gun, which lacked both power and accuracy, that Staryu wasn't a threat to him. But if Dratini refused to attack, the damage would eventually lead to his defeat. Just as Ash was about to recall his Pokemon, blue sparks of electricity cackled around the bump on Dratini's head. A moment later, a wave of concentrated electricity bolted at Staryu, cackling around the water type as it pitifully shivered and cried anguishingly. Its orb dimmed to a low flicker for a few moments before it stopped and Staryu slumped on the ground. But Dratini wasn't done. His foe had all but fallen, yet he charged another shock wave and sent Staryu crashing back into the stream of water nearby, its NCED cries banging deep into Ash's eardrums. The second attack had been even deadlier than the first. Staryu, Misty cried, rushing into the river and taking her fainted Pokemon in her arms. Ash scowled at the many burns and bruises on the Staryu, his arms extending but his lips failing him as he tried to mouth words of apology. He could only watch as the distraught girl tapped Staryu with its Pokeball and glared daggers at Ash. Her eyes bloodshot. You should be ashamed. Going around with a Pokemon you can't even control. You're a pathetic excuse for a trainer. Ash didn't find the words to respond to her claims. He wanted to apologize, but he didn't like being insulted. As his thoughts drifted, searching for words to speak, Misty whistled off on her bicycle before he had the time to speak. Ash blinked. His teeth sunk callously deep into his lips, drawing a drop of blood that he absent-mindedly licked. She wasn't wrong. He couldn't go around with a Pokemon he didn't have control of. That was his failure as a trainer. He recalled Dratini into his Pokeball and gazed at it. He had a long way to go before he could become a Pokemon master. Night had come and went, and Ash had a lot on his mind. His mood hadn't been the brightest since the battle with Misty. He'd thought that Dratini was a troublemaker but would obey him in battles, but he now understood how naive he'd been. It D'n't be that easy to conquer a Pokemon even Lance called difficult to handle. That night, he'd eaten the last of the homemade food that his mom had packed for him, and fed Dratini the Pokemon food he'd brought. He had to admit that Dratini's eating habits weren't one he'd associate with a headstrong Pokemon like him. His attempts at talking to Dratini that night had been in vain. The dragon showed interest in him at times but would rebel when Ash tried to get more comfortable. Although, in that time, Ash had noticed that Dratini seemed interested the moment he brought up anything regarding Pokemon battles. A new dawn refreshed Ash's spirits. Ash had already eaten his breakfast in a small cafe on the way and he'd let out Dratini again. He poured some Pokemon food in his bowl and placed the bowl in front of Dratini. "There you go." He smiled warmly. "Eat up, Dratini." Even though the events of last evening frustrated him, Ash couldn't help but delight when he looked at Dratini. Dratini I didn't need another invitation as he dug into his meal. He didn't devour the food, instead opting to eat nice and slow. But Ash could tell that he was enjoying it as he chewed on one chunk after another. He grunted when the bowl had emptied. Dratini was a fond eater. "You want more?" Ash asked in amusement. Upon receiving a slightly hesitant nod from the Pokemon, he chuckled and poured some more food into the bowl. Dratini finished off the last of the chunks with a satisfied squeal. Ash couldn't help but smile easily at that. A few hours later, Ash stood against a brown-haired trainer, and in front of him was his Dratini. The Pokemon he faced was a small brown avian Pokemon with red wings. Both Dratini and Spearow stared at each other aggressively, none of them breaking their gaze. "Spearow, Fury Attack!" the boy yelled. His Spearow obeyed as it flapped its wings and rushed towards Dratini, its crooked beak glowing in a silver hue. "Let it come to you, Dratini," Ash instructed, carefully eyeing Spearow. "Now, use Wrap." Ash's command came right before Spearow hit Dratini with its beak. But it could only do it once as Dratini had the flying type in his grasp, his long body wrapped firmly around it. Spearow struggled to get out but eventually cried as Dratini tightened his grip even further. Ash clenched his fists, overjoyed as his lips slipped into a mad grin. Finally, Dratini had done something he'd told him to. However, he realized that he could celebrate later. "Shock Wave," he ordered. "Break out of it." Its trainer cried in fear, eyes widened as he realized the danger of the electric attack. Blue jolts of electricity concentrated around Dratini and Spearow shrieked haplessly at the mercy of the shock. Its wings jostled against Dratini but to no avail. The dragon Fina LLY letting go of its foe once its struggle had ended. "Return, Spearow," the boy recalled his fallen flying type. He stepped forward and offered a handshake to Ash. "You've got an amazing Pokemon, dude." Accepting the handshake, Ash grinned. "That's true." As the boy left, he bent down and petted Dratini for a well-earned victory. Although, Dratini wasn't amused as he instantly glanced away. Slap. Ping Ash's hand aside and slithering under the shadow of a nearby tree. Ash chuckled wryly. "I guess we'll have to take it slow." Ash fought a few trainers on the way, and he couldn't express the joy he'd felt when he won Pokemon battles with Dratini. To his pleasant surprise, Dratini had caused little ruckus since the battle with Misty. Dratini hadn't obeyed all of his orders but Ash was happy enough with the ones he had. He reminded himself that that would change with time. So far, he was well on track. Viridian City was as large and overwhelming as he remembered. Tall skyscrapers sprawled across the landscape like mountains, burying the more old and cultural structures. Pudgy and greasy scents glutted his nostrils. He never felt further away from home. It wasn't oppressive, but he preferred air fresh. The city was a dream for many a country people. The facilities and opportunities it provided made it one of the biggest cities in the region of Kanto, but he couldn't care less for it. More than a week had passed since Ash had started his journey, and he'd had no major stops in between. He hadn't caught a single Pokemon in that time, but he didn't mind. He'd fought enough trainers on the way to make the time worthwhile. Numerous battles and victories later, he believed he'd had a substantial learning curve and gotten closer to Dratini, if only a little. He genuinely thought that he'd found it easier to communicate with Dratini after each passing day, after each battle. He'd begun to listen to Ash more and more, and although the odd uncalled attack and bouts of disobedience still occurred, it was getting better. Over the past few days, Ash had been pensive about a name for Dratini. He'd pondered over one for his Charmander before getting his starter, but it wasn't fated for him to get the fire type. Draco, Dracon, Drake. Those names sounded a bit too common. There was one name that he thought would suit Dratini's personality perfectly though. And it sounded cool. Kaiser. He'd ask if the name struck Dratini's fancy later, although he wasn't sure how the little proud dragon would take to being named. A sigh escaped Ash as the Pokémon Center came into view. The T.O. story building, which operated as a hospital for Pokémon, also acted as a lodge for traveling trainers. Provisions such as battling and training grounds for Pokémon were a welcome addition. It was a trainer's hub, and major cities like Viridian housed multiple of these in different parts of the city. On the way, Ash had come across the police station right after he'd entered the city. A quick identification check through his Pokédex was all it took for the local officer Jenny to allow him entry. The city bustled with vehicles honking, chattering people and Pokémon, but, thankfully, it was much quieter around the Pokémon Center. Ash entered the building to find several people, some trying to get their Pokémon healed while others got their Pokémon back from the nursing counters. The restaurant to his left housed more than a few people as some chatted with other trainers, some with their Pokémon, and a few preferred to eat their meals alone in peace. Ash walked to one of the two counters in the Pokémon Center. Each minded by a Nurse Joy and a Chansey. It was a culture around the world that most Pokémon centers followed. They were managed by at least one Nurse Joy, amongst other doctors and nurses. The most common feature amongst the female Joys was their beautiful hair, which always had some shade of pink. Ash reached the counter. "Good evening, Nurse Joy," he greeted politely. "Good evening," she chimed back merrily. "How may I help you?" Ash returned her smile. "Do you mind healing my Pokémon?" he asked, placing Dratini's Pokéball on the counter. Dratini probably needed little treatment since Ash had used potions on any minor injuries that he'd suffered in his battles, and there weren't a lot. But he still thought it better to get a quick check just in case. Quick checku. PS in Pokémon centers barely took a few minutes and were enough to heal Pokémon completely, unless the damage was more severe. Nurse Joy nodded and called for a pink ovoid Pokémon, a Chansey, who took Dratini's Pokéball, which Joy had placed in a tray, and merrily skipped to the treatment room behind them. Its jovial squeals brought a smile to Ash's face. Chansey enjoyed healing Pokémon from what he'd learned about them, and this one seemed to be no exception. A couple of minutes later, the same Chansey brought the Pokéball and handed it over to the pink-haired nurse, who thanked the Pokémon for the help. "Here you go," Joy said, keeping the Pokéball on the counter. "Your Pokémon's all healed up." "Thanks, Nurse Joy." Ash flashed a smile to the pretty woman as he accepted the Pokéball. The next afternoon, Ash found himself headed to the battling arena behind the Pokémon Center. He'd decided to take a day of rest in the city before he made off for Viridian Forest. The daunting nature of the forest that spawned the area between Viridian and Pewter was common knowledge. Some of the stories that did the rounds in the Pokémon Center startled him, trainers getting lost inside for days, weeks or months. Swarms of Beedrill and other venomous bugs victimizing ignorant starting trainers who dared to enter the perilous woodland and invade their dwellings, amongst other gossip, made him shudder to think what it would have in store for him. If Ash were to walk through the forest straight, it would take him close to 2 weeks to reach the end. And then, there was Route 2, which was a short road connecting the outskirts of Viridian Forest to Pewter City. The trip would be long enough, so he decided not to rush. Ash knew that there was a Pokémon gym in Viridian City itself. But he also knew that it required trainers to have at least 7 gym badges before being qualified to challenge it. Most gyms in the Kanto region didn't have the restriction of having a certain number of badges, but some did. And Viridian Gym was famed for its difficulty. Barely any challengers had won a gym badge from it in years. And even then, those badges were won because the gym leader was away and the gym was being cared for by gym trainers. Ash felt an odd excitement at the prospect of attempting such a difficult challenge when he was stronger. He would surely return. Cries of a Pokémon battle brought a spring in Ash's strides. He grinned as he reached the battlefield and saw a Charmander pitted against a small tadpole Pokémon, Poliwag. The battle was at its conclusion as the Poliwag had many wounds throughout its body. Charmander fared better with only a few minor injuries. A light blast of orange flames from the Charmander effectively ended the battle and its victory. However, at what met his gaze right after that, Ash frowned. The Charmander's trainer, purple-haired and dressed in a brown jacket, kicked the little lizard Pokémon disdainfully. Ash's eyes bulged at the sight, his fingers runched into cannons and his nostrils flared. He grimaced, unable to believe the brutality with which the trainer pumped his foot into Charmander's gut again. The poor Charmander didn't even try to retaliate, it cried at the pain. But its distraught gaze remained silently fixed on the floor. "You weakling." Charmander's trainer grunted loudly, his teeth gritting as he shot a dirty look at Charmander. "You took so long to win against that joke of a Pokémon." Charmander grimaced, shrieked and braced itself for another one of its trainer's vicious kicks. But Ash charged towards the loathsome trainer and slammed his hand into the boy's chest, driving him towards the wall. Driven by rage at the sight of violence against creatures he so dearly loved, Ash held the boy by the scruff of his neck against the wall. "What did you think you were doing?" Ash scowled, his voice coarse. "Pokémon were to be caught and befriended, not abused like this junkie was just doing. Fools like you don't deserve to be trainers. Don't you have any shame treating a Pokémon like that?" "That's my Pokémon. I can do what I want with it." Charmander's trainer snarled, knocking Ash's hands off of him, forcing Ash to let go of his collar. He straightened himself up, adjusting his shirt. "Who are you to teach me how I should use my Pokémon, anyway? You think you can get away with this?" Ash glared at him. He could feel the blood rising in his eyes, surging to his brain. "It's a crime to abuse Pokémon. Why don't we teach this kid a lesson, Damien?" Came another amused voice from behind Ash. Ash turned around but his scowl didn't lighten. He glared down at the new guy with the same disdain as he'd looked at Charmander's trainer, now identified as Damien. If Ash were to fight these guys with his sole Pokémon, he'd be at a disadvantage in numbers. But the challenge didn't bother him, the one-on-one battles had been far too easy for Dratini anyway. Ash narrowed his eyes and unclipped the only Pokeball on his belt. "Let's see who teaches who." He smirked. "HMPH. Damien snorted smugly. "He thinks he can beat us in a Pokémon battle." He grinned, his eyes glinting evilly. "Let's kick this kid's ass." The other trainer smirked as he removed a Pokeball from his pocket. Ash rolled his eyes at their ignorance. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. When his Dratini materialized, Damien and his friend's jaws stooped. And Ash was sure that they'd have plummeted to the floor had it been physically possible. They gasped, then grit their teeth. Ash savored every moment of their frustration, before calling out their Pokémon. Damien had chosen a purple bat-like Pokémon who bared its sharp fangs while the other boy's Pokémon was a gray-colored humanoid with bulging muscles. Dratini. Ash got his starter's attention. These guys treat their Pokémon like tools. Let's teach them a lesson. Dratini sent a confused glare Ash's way, but his confusion vanished when he laid eyes on the battered Charmander. He snarled at his foes, his eyes dangerously sparkling with almost as much rage as Ash. "Golbat, wing attack!" Damien shouted with intensified rage. He probably wasn't too fond of someone else telling him to change his filthy ways. "Use Karate Chop, Machop," the other boy ordered. "Make use of your speed to dodge and then use Shock Wave on Golbat," Ash commanded, considering his opponent's Pokémon. His best bet was to get rid of one of the two Pokémon first, regardless of the fact that Dratini might have been strong enough to take them both on at once. Muscular power concentrated in Machop's fists as its muscles swelled and it dashed forward. On its side, Golbat's wings gained an almost transparent glow and both of them dangerously dashed at Dratini. The dragon, though, showed sublime agility to slide away from Machop, its fists meeting thin air as it growled back towards Dratini. Golbat, however, proved faster than Ash and Dratini had imagined, as it swung its wings at the dragon. Dratini leapt up evading the first of the swings, but a second one landed a hit and sent him crashing on the ground, sweeping backwards. Golbat hissed victoriously, but it didn't realize that it was only fueling Dratini's rage. "Ha ha." Damien laughed sinisterly. "That's what you get for being so full of yourself." He was thrilled to get an early strike. Wing attack again. Dr. Dratini had already begun charging bluish thunder on top of his head and he let the electricity rip through the atmosphere, crackling and thundering its way towards Golbat. Golbat barely had a millisecond to process the words of its trainer before the shock wave had it screeching. Its jolted, quivering form floated in the air, then fell on the ground like a feather. Machop had swung its fists and missed Dratini again. It angrily growled at Dratini, who was all too happy to roar back even louder. "Use karate chop again, Machop," the other boy yelled. "Hit that snake this time." Ash took a moment to observe Golbat, and deduced it could no longer fight. If it tried to, it wouldn't pose a threat. "Let's use Dragon Breath." Machop's encore yielded similar results to its previous attempts, but its eyes widened in horror when Dratini spat flames of dragon energy. The fire cracked and hissed like a whip as it flew through the air, striking it in the gut. Burn marks charred into the Pokémon's body. "Now, Aqua Jet," Ash said, a ghost of a smile playing on his face. Dratini summoned a gush of pulsing water. The water weaved like a needle to a thread around his body as he roared and dashed at his foe with superspeed. Ash's eyes failed to follow the move and he only saw an anguishing Machop crash against the wall when Dratini's Aqua Jet made contact. "What?" Damien cried in disbelief, his jaw wide open. He gritted his teeth in exasperation before he noticed the glare that was aimed at him from the Pokémon that had just destroyed his Golbat. Damn! He recalled Golbat and his friend did the same to his Machop. Then threw a Pokéball toward the wall from his pocket, which crashed and broke in two. He turned his frustrated stare at Charmander to his right, who'd been observing the battle with reticent curiosity. "I don't need you anymore, Charmander. You're useless," he yelled before he hastily rushed out through the door, followed by his friend. Ash's glare softened moments after the thugs had left and he felt a triumphant smile creep in. It had been more than a simple victory in a Pokémon fight, it was one for a Pokémon. He stepped towards the Charmander, who appeared shocked as it gazed at Ash with glittering eyes. Dejection soon took over as its face fell into a saddened look, its tail languidly drooping on the floor as the flames on it dimmed ever so slightly, but enough for Ash to notice. Its injuries weren't severe, but Ash winced at the sight of sizzling blood creeping from the bruises laid on it by the kicks and stamps from its former trainer rather. Rage filled Ash's blood again. Such atrocity against Pokémon was unfathomable and unacceptable. Despite the growing temptation to find and beat Damien a million times harder than it had done to Charmander, Ash composed himself. Carefully, Ash squatted to Charmander's level and stroked its head, the fire type plotting its gaze to him. Ash smiled warmly at Charmander, whose face brightened as if it had seen a hero. He gently picked up Charmander. It struggled, trying to claw its way out, then lurching its tail, but a few strokes on its head calmed it down. Ash still smiled at Charmander warmly and it finally gave in. Coiling its body in Ash's embrace, its skin somewhat scorching for a moment, but the heat died down soon enough. "Don't worry, Charmander," he whispered as gently as he could. "Nothing like that will ever happen to you again." Charmander had gone through enough. A minute later, Ash had reached the healing counter. "Nurse Joy," he called out. "Can you treat this Charmander, please?" Smiling with as much calm as she always did, Joy nodded. "Of course. Can you please recall it and its Pokéball?" she requested. Ash grimaced, eyes squinting when he felt Charmander almost tremble at the mention of a Pokéball. "You see, Nurse Joy," his gaze dipped at the Charmander as he reached to pet it. Its tail perked up slightly at the gesture. "This Charmander is not mine. Its trainer left it after a battle." Nurse Joy caught Ash's drift and called for Chansey immediately, who carried Charmander inside in a wheeled stretcher. It seemed afraid as it was being taken away, its eyes pleading to Ash. But Ash's smile assured it that it'd be okay. "What's the Charmander's story?" Nurse Joy asked, leaning on the desk. "That didn't look like a wild Charmander. It was being abused by its trainer," Ash began, fists clenching reflexively at the mere thought of Damien and his ways. He dearly wanted to squash the image of the Charmander's sufferings out of his mind. "When I confronted him about it, and told him to not do that. We had a battle and then," he sighed, taking a deep breath. "That guy threw Charmander's Pokéball, saying it wasn't needed anymore." "How terrible," Joy mumbled. These things happen from time to time. There are trainers who take out their own shortcomings on their Pokémon." Ash glanced at her and saw a dark shadow hover over her face. "I see." Logic failed him when he thought about the matter. He couldn't comprehend the reasons for trainers to act that way. But he couldn't deny that there must be others out there who did the same. He shuddered when he imagined and questioned if there were trainers even worse than Damien, Pokemon in even more pain than Charmander. Not a word was uttered by either Joy or Ash until Chansey brought Charmander out again. Its physical condition appeared great. But its mental state might not be the same. Its eyes bore sadness, making Ash's stomach sink. The poor Pokemon probably had no clue what to do next. "Hey Charmander, how are you feeling now?" Ash asked in a low, comforting tone as he bent down. The Charmander's head rose and it grunted to say it was okay. In the few minutes that Charmander was being treated, Ash had deeply thought about asking Charmander to join him. He would love to have a Pokemon he so desperately desired and yearned for not more than a few days back. But even more than that, Ash wanted the Charmander to be happy. If it decided that would be with him, great. If not, then Ash wouldn't be upset. Maybe leaving the Charmander with Nurse Joy would be a better idea. She could try to find a shelter for it, or better yet, keep it with her if she wanted. The different scenarios ceased playing in Ash's head as he petted the fire type gently. "Charmander, if you want, you can come with me on my journey." He fervently awaited Charmander's response. To Ash's joy, Charmander's face perked up and it howled excitedly, jumping on the desk as a smile played on its face. "Really?" Ash asked. Hi's chest felt light at the prospect of having a Charmander. It nodded furiously as its tail swung, making Nurse Joy retreat from the desk, the flame-tipped tail wagging closer to her, though she grinned, and it leapt into Ash's arms. Charmander's excitement died down a few moments later and Ash placed it on the counter again. He drew an empty Pokeball from his pocket and gulped. He was about to catch his first Pokemon. Not in a way he'd imagined it. He'd thought he'd have a long, close fight alongside his starter, and after a tense battle, he'd have his first capture. But he didn't mind this. He never imagined that his first two Pokemon would be Dratini and Charmander. Well, he'd thought it would be one of those, then another, but not both. He tapped Charmander softly with the Pokeball and it was sucked inside in a brilliant flash of crimson light. Ash watched with bated breath as the Pokeball rattled a few times before it finally settled and ceased movement. He blinked, then felt his eyes twinkle with flare and his heart thumped so hard that it might have left marks on his ribs. Then, it sunk in that this was reality. His lips curled from ear to ear. The Pokemon that his fortunes had denied him of was now his. His dream of getting a Charizard could be now fulfilled. Lucky way to catch a Pokemon, isn't it? He gasped out. Nurse Joy shook her head. That wasn't all luck, she grinned. I can certainly say that much. The sign pointing towards Viridian Forest stood in front of Ash. This was going to be quite an adventure. He'd just walked past the final checkpoint between Viridian City and the forest, which was also a place for trainers going to and fro, to rest. He stood ever so close to entering the woods that he'd heard so much about. Finally, Ash began the trek. Arlie walked for a quarter of an hour before the woods became so numerous and gigantic that it blocked almost all of the sun's rays from stealing a peek into the forest. The trees around him varied in size. He couldn't see the tip of the tallest, yet the shortest seemed to be just as high if he looked. He swore they didn't seem nearly as tall when he'd been on the outskirts. He felt tiny beneath them. Insignificant, as if his existence didn't matter. The feeling only grew when he ambled a few more steps in the forest that led so many adrift. The ground concealed itself by lush green grass or moss or leaves or petals or wildflowers. A creaking of a dry leaf under his foot seemed like the only sound he'd heard after an eternity of silence. But after that, it felt as if his hearing had transcended dead human levels and crept into the perceptive realm of bats under the shelter of a murky cave. Buzzes and squeaks of Pokemon he couldn't distinguish penetrated his eardrums and he felt lost amidst a barrage of noises that had his head swirl, then strain, then ache. Rustles accompanied the squeaks as a few dense, emerald-green bushes spread around the giant trees when he walked further, swishing and jiggling every so often to indicate the presence of hidden beings. Assurance that these were simply bug-type Pokemon and nothing else brought him calm for hardly a minute before another clattering of leaves or twigs would leave him in a cold sweat. This was Viridian Forest. The gossip paled in comparison to the reality of the place. Regardless, he continued walking down the endless dirt road, until dusk slowly came and wrapped around the trees loosely. He sighed, exhaustion gradually creeping up on him. Ash laid on the cool, hard ground, his gaze captivated by the beautiful orange glow of the sinking sun. Arms reposefully stretched wide, his fingers toying with the blades of grass every few seconds. There weren't many clearings, devoid of those thick trees that crowded Viridian Forest. And he wanted to enjoy what little time he'd get in the setting. His first day in Viridian Forest had been uncannily and unexpectedly uneventful, after the initial hours of excruciating unease. He wouldn't say he'd gotten used to the nature of it, he didn't think he would ever get used to it if he spent his entire life here. The odd battle with trainers, mostly bug-type specialists who seemed to have spent far longer in the forest than him, had allowed him to fight off the anxiety though. So he felt much better now, much more relaxed. He'd used the map in his Pokédex to progress through the woods, following it as closely as he could. He shivered at the thought of being lost. Dratini and Charmander, whom Ash had let out of their balls a few minutes back, gazed at the lovely, relaxing scene beside him. They looked calm and content, especially Charmander. Ash had worried if the little lizard would come out of its shell after the cruelty it had endured. But his fears were unfounded. Contrarily, Charmander seemed to have had a calming effect on Dratini. The dragon hadn't misbehaved as much in its company and they seemed to be getting along, in whatever little time they'd spent together. He'd let them watch each other's battles so it could have been the reason. He was pleasantly surprised by the skill Charmander had shown. It was a fine battler and its latent potential had Ash's heart tremble in excitement. Damien must have been an even bigger fool than Ash had initially thought to not have even scratched the surface of Charmander's potential. Dratini, Charmander, Ash said, his face turned to look at his Pokémon, who both looked back at him. His gaze returned to the sky again. Someday, when you're all grown up and can fly, I want you two to take me up there. He pointed to the darkened clouds above. But he thought he could see well beyond them. I want us to touch the clouds together. They remained quiet for a few moments and Ash heard their perplexed cries, then watched their heads tilt. They glanced at the sky, puzzled. But their eyes gleamed with allure almost in unison, shining under the sunset as if they were a pair of green and violet orbs. Charmander and Dratini shared a quick glance and determination replaced temptation in their eyes. Ash chuckled at the thought that they must have been trying to think of a way to grow wings. But they both could do it. Dratini and Charmander glared at Ash and hissed and barked, tails throbbing and fists clenched in case of Charmander. The two were determined to see this through and Ash couldn't be happier to have them by his side. Maybe this was a good time to bring up the topic of names. Hey Dratini, he called out, his eyes peering into the dragons. He couldn't deny that he felt the tiniest bit nervous about this. But he had Dratini's attention. I've thought of a name for you. Dratini whirred, feverishly slithering a few feet closer to Ash. He hissed again, sparkling blue eyes gaping into Ash's. Ash uckled at the excited response by Dratini. This was going better than he'd hoped. Much better. Kaiser. Dratini's face tilted, his gaze still fixed on his trainer. His long, blue tail quivered, rasping the lush blades of grass. Ash's features lit up at the coo that Kaiser uttered. He yanked his face away when he saw Ash grinning at him. Ah, the little devil was embarrassed. He appeared to like the name though. From now on, you're Kaiser, Ash cheered. It means emperor and I think it suits you perfectly. Once he'd fed those words to his brain, Kaiser sheepishly glided away. He appeared to enjoy the grandeur of the name. Ash shook his head at the antics of his starter and then turned his attention to his second Pokémon. Charmander happily swung its tail around and shrieked at him, a few tiny embers wisping in the air before fading. Ash's bright smile turned into a rampant grin. He didn't even have to ask if Charmander wanted a name, he could tell by his friend's reaction that it craved for one. He'd had a quick scan for Charmander with his Pokédex while he was in the Pokémon Center and it had told him that the fire type was male. That was perfect since Ash had thought of names his Charmander, the one that he'd expected to get from Professor Oak, believing it would be a boy. Not that he had any way of knowing that. He'd mulled over it for days before he began his journey and he'd eventually settled on one. Would you like to be called Ignis? Ash asked, his gaze meeting Charmander's who instantly bobbed his head up and down. It probably didn't even matter to Charmander what name it was. He seemed exuberant just to have one. His tail still wagged around as he growled in delight and leapt into Ash's arms. The sudden hug had taken Ash by surprise, but he let his new Est Pokemon lick him to his heart's content. You like the name, don't you? Ash managed between laughs as Ignis continued to tickle his face raptly. Later, Ash had let his Pokemon spend the night outside. It served the purpose of them protecting him from threats that the wild dwellers of the forest would obviously pose to him, and it would also let them get to know each other better. The special Pokemon food that he'd bought in Viridian City for Dragon and Fire types came in handy as the two seemed to have enjoyed it more than normal. And they continued to savor the food, gulping it down bite by bite as their breakfast. Ash had finished his own far too quickly in comparison. But he found something worth doing in the meantime. He drew his Pokédex from his bag and scanned Ignis. Charmander, the lizard Pokemon. When the tip of Charmander's tail burns brightly, that indicates it's in good health. It said in its mechanical voice, which caught Ignis, as well as Kaiser's attention as they ate. This Charmander is male. Its ability is Blaze. Its moves are Ember, Scratch, Growl and Metal Claw. Ash mused as he pressed a button on the Pokédex, then another, and read the moves that Ignis could learn. Dragon Rage. Ash read the text accompanying the name, considering it as a potential move worth learning. The move would add a counter for Ignis against water types since his other moves wouldn't have much effect on them. Kaiser could also easily learn the move, although it would be more of a variant of his dragon power which he already used in the form of Dragon Breath. Dragon Rage it was. A move worth investing in. A few more hours passed, a few more battles, and some wild Caterpie and Weedle on the way, the bug types escaping at his first sight. Not that Ash had tried to catch them. Kaiser and Ignis had stayed outside after their last battle and walked with him, chatting to one another. What Ash would give to understand their talk and share in their titters. Just then, Ash heard a few chirps from up above. He glanced towards the sky and caught a glimpse of a small, plump avian who sailed through the trees, meticulously piloting through the gaps in between. The cries Sue. Rounding it belonged to two Spearow who chased the Pidgey in rage, their wings flopping errantly amidst their ragged movements. The chase continued and Ash sprinted to follow the action. Pidgey turned its tiny head back, chirped and then pulled its wings wide while spinning back. It flew with grace, speed and power as its silver-tainted wings crashed into the hounding Spearow one after another. He too refused to back away and dashed at Pidgey but it fought them off, first with another wing attack, then speeding through them in a show of impressive speed that left the Spearow gawking their heads in search of their prey. Pidgey slammed one Spearow with another wing attack but the second's eyes glinted as its beak gashed into Pidgey's feathery gut. They cawed, almost akin to a victorious and mocking laugh, then swept through the air in pursuit of the descending Pidgey who had little control over its body. That all changed a moment later though, as a rainbow sheen, pretty as the phenomenon itself, engulfed Pidgey. Its body grew in proportions, starting from its wings that spread into a curl and its tail gained feathers. Its head and body changed shape, a beautiful mane emerging from its tufts. The newly evolved Pidgeotto chirped resoundingly and its glare honed in on its pursuers. Showing speed greater than its previous exploits, Pidgeotto gushed towards the Spearow whose earlier haughtiness had vanished just as they probably hoped they would. Before they could make their escape, Pidgeotto blindingly closed the distance with quick attack and slashed one wing on each of the Spearow. The two wild birds knew better than to stay and fled into the darkness of the trees much faster than they'd arrived. The calm nature of a Pidgeotto stopped the avian from giving chase as it flew. Aided in the air with nothing but a chirp. Wow, that was great, Ash exclaimed, amazed by the display of speed by the flying type. Equally enthralling was the evolution he'd just witnessed. Kaiser, let's catch that Pidgeotto, shock wave. Kaiser never shied away from a battle. He charged electricity in mere moments and launched it at Pidgeotto who'd just noticed them. It shrieked in agony as the super effective move jolted its feathers, sparkling its wings. The attack had its feathers scrambled and surging and shook its being. It recovered faster than Ash had anticipated, and it descended once its eyes fixed on Kaiser. Disappearing from Ash's vision for a moment, only a few visible trails to follow, then appearing right on top of Kaiser as it slammed itself on the dragon. Its quick attack is so much faster now, Ash noted. Kaiser grimaced from the impact of the move but that would hardly be enough to keep him down. Ash wanted this bird even more now. Aqua Jet. Kaiser's speed was on full display as he summoned water around himself and then flung himself at Pidgeotto, who'd hung low to the ground. It tried to fight him off with a gash of its wings, but Kaiser had already jutted back to the ground by then. He snarled triumphantly at the bird and it didn't shy away from returning a defiant cry. "Now dragon breath," Ash commanded. A stream of draconic energy poured at Pidgeotto B. It glided through the air with impressive maneuverability, wings outstretched and body floating as if it weighed nothing. It charged at Kaiser with a combination of quick attack, then wing attack. ND lashed its powered wings into the dragon. Ash grinned. It was rare to see wild Pokémon show such brilliant mastery of their moveset. Kaiser shrieked but stood strong even as Pidgeotto soared back into the air. He launched another dragon breath and Pidgeotto retreated further up into the clear skies that were so rare in the forest. Ash feared the Pidgeotto might try to run, although it didn't seem like it wanted to. And he'd have no way to chase it if it did. He needed to lure it closer to the surface. "Kaiser, use Leer. Try to provoke it to come at you," Ash said after a long, thoughtful moment. Kaiser shot a puzzled glance at Ash, but didn't disobey. He snarled, his eyes glinting as he took a measure of his foe, mockingly challenging it to try and make a move. It worked. Pidgeotto took the bait and dashed at Kaiser. Descending sharply with its glorious wings outstretched, currents of air sizzling in its trail. "Now use Wrap, then Shock Wave," Ash roared. Just as the provoked Pidgeotto shoved him back with its wings, Kaiser held steady and coiled its flexible, long body around it. Ravaged cries of a desperate bird swept across the area, shaking the air in its wake as Pidgeotto lailed its body helplessly in the constraints of Kaiser. If it were visible, Ash was sure he'd have seen Kaiser smirk. The Dratini let sparks loose and Pidgeotto cried agonizingly. Ash grimaced at the pain that the bird went through. But Kaiser's vice-like grip remained until he was sure he'd won. Ash readied a Pokeball and as soon as Pidgeotto was set free, bruised, beaten and burned, he lunged the Pokeball at it. His eyes twitched and sweat pooled down his forehead as its body vanished into the ball and it shook. Ash's heart hammered in his chest. The Pokeball wiggled back and forth, until, finally, it stopped. Ash walked towards his second capture and his grin couldn't have spread any further if he'd tried as he picked up Pidgeotto's Pokeball. Ignis and Kaiser joined him, the former merrily jumping around as he gazed eagerly at the Pokeball in Ash's hand. "We now have another friend," Ash grinned as he glanced at Ignis, then at Kaiser. "Good job, Kaiser," Ignis leapt again. Then stepped towards Kaiser and praised him some more. Ash's starter flushed at the cheers from his friend. The two continued to communicate with shrieks, then squealed in delight. Ash wasn't sure why, but he was happy nonetheless. A quick look at his watch told Ash that it would be a good time to take a break. The group walked a little more and soon found the shades of a large, dense tree, one that didn't creep the soul out of Ash, to dwell under for a while. Ash let his first two Pokémon eat their lunch but decided to have his own meal later. He rummaged his backpack and withdrew a potion. Then let Pidgeotto's Pokeball open. The avian manifested, and Ash couldn't resist a wince at the wounds on its body. The last shock wave from point-blank range had taken its toll. This might sting a bit. He quickly yet carefully sprayed the potion on the more obvious and harsh wounds first, then moved on to the lighter ones. The Pokémon cried as the spray plunged into its feather and then inside the flesh. And even Ignis and Kaiser had abandoned their food and came to it when they'd heard its cries. "You'll be good to go in a while," Ash smiled tenderly and stroked the soft, feathery head of his Pidgeotto. The newly captured Pokémon gazed at its trainer, then spared a glance for Ignis and Kaiser who both looked at it with rampant curiosity. Ignis was the first to cry out a few words. Then Kaiser shrieked a few times himself. It wasn't difficult to see that Ignis had affected Kaiser positively, even making it more friendly. Their friendship had blossomed swiftly. Pidgeotto's face brightened after a minute or two, the effects of the potion visible on her body as the few drops of blood that dripped earlier ceased. A few minutes later, Ash poured some Pokémon food in a bowl and placed it in front of Pidgeotto. "Eat it, Pidgeotto. It'll make you feel better." At first, Pidgeotto seemed hesitant but brought itself to steadily clam a piece of its meal. That was all it took for it to decide the food was to its liking and eat it vigorously. It must have been a different taste for the bird, much more packed in nutrients than the vegetation found in the wilderness. While it ate, Ash pointed his Pokédex at it. Pidgeotto, the bird Pokémon and the evolved form of Pidgey. It is armed with sharp claws and dives from the sky to capture its prey. Unlike the more gentle Pidgeotto can be dangerous. It can carry its prey to its nest over 60 miles away. This Pidgeotto is female. Its ability is Keen Eye. Its moves are Gust, Sand Attack, Quick Attack, Whirlwind and Wing Attack. That's a pretty good moveset. Ash complimented and petted his newest Pokémon once again. Pidgeotto chirped a gentle cry as she mouthed more of the food. He caressed her soft as wool feathers. The next 2 days went by without any unwanted incident. Ash progressed further and further into the forest, following the track in the forest with an eye on his position on the map in his Pokédex. His Pokémon had kept him company for most of that time, sparring a few times against trainers on their way. The trees had thinned evenly where he walked and he had more than a bit of sunshine to bathe in. Suddenly, a few rustles altered him. His senses sharpened as the sound got louder and closer. Footsteps, he concluded. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure to his left. And behind it was another figure which filled Ash's curiosity. His eyes widened when he caught sight of the chaser. The first shadow ran by him in almost a blur while the second one slowed down, but it didn't relent in its chase. Ash scampered through the woods, ignoring the buzzes of the bugs that resulted, and a minute or two later, he caught up to them. "Wait, Leaf," he called out. The one giving chase, a girl his age. Caramel-haired and sporting a round hat, shorter than a floppy yet bigger than a fedora, stopped in her tracks and promptly spun around. "Ash," she smiled brightly after a brief moment of surprise. Her shoulders hunching as she eventually leaned on her knees. Ash jogged a few more steps and caught up to her. He shook his head as he watched her chest rise and fall, heavy, sagged breaths that graced his ears. He beamed at her. "You're already in Viridian Forest, huh?" Ash felt the growing need to pant, as his hands soon fell on his knees. That was quite a chase. Leaf let her body lazily collapse on the ground, uncaring about the dirt and soil beneath. "You think I'm some kind of a slowpoke in the form of a girl." She held out her tongue playfully and Ash couldn't help but chuckle at her humor, dry as it was. One of his oldest and closest friends, Leaf was one of the trainers who was supposed to start her journey on the same day he had. Of course, Ash hadn't waited until the other trainers arrived. And his lack of patience was to thank for that. Not that it would have mattered. To be honest though, if there was one friend that he'd have wanted to meet before he left, it would be Leaf. "No," Ash replied to her after the longest time. He let himself fall on the ground beside her, still taking a few shallow breaths. "I'm just surprised you made it as far as I did. So you did think that?" Leaf snorted, pouting then looking the other way in exasperation. Ash was sure she'd forced that. "You didn't even wait for us that day." Her voice lost its vigor over those words. "Not even me." There was no defense against that. He really shouldn't have left like that, but he couldn't help it. "Yeah, that was stupid of me," he said softly. "I'm sorry about that. By the way." Leaf finally turned to face him again, her face lighting up about whatever she'd just remembered. "Professor Oak said that you started with a really amazing Pokémon that isn't one of the starters." Her eyes twinkled with nothing but curiosity. "What's that Pokémon?" "Yeah, I sure did," Ash grinned. "My starter is a Dratini," he boasted, swelling with pride. Leaf's eyes bulged. "That's amazing," she gasped. Ash shot her a half-smile as she took a few moments to calm her breathing. "Anyway, I sure am glad to meet you here. You're like my hero now, you know." Ash's eyebrow curved. "Hero? Why is that? I didn't do anything to save you." Leaf laid herself flat on the ground, her hands pillowing her flowing brown hair as her hat tumbled a couple feet away. "You totally did," she pointed out. Ash's eyes followed her hat rolling on the ground, a short burst of wind threatening to blow it away with the fallen leaves, but he snatched it before it could. Leaf didn't seem to care as she lost her gaze in the sky. "I thought I would be lost here forever. But I am so lucky to have met you." He joined her on the ground, handing the hat to her which she grabbed absent-mindedly. "What were you after? Which Pokémon was it?" Ash asked. Its speed was great for a Pokémon that seemed only slightly shorter than Ash himself, from what he could derive from its shadow, at least. "It was a Scyther," she confirmed. Ash's eyebrows almost touched his temples at the mention of Scyther. They weren't the most common Pokémon going around. "I guess you could say this was my lucky day. I came across a Scyther and as I was trying to catch it." I found you, she giggled happily as she too laid her entire body on the ground. I hope I could just teleport out to Pewter City though, her face squished. Ash would have been surprised had she liked Viridian Forest. He was already tired of it and Leaf had probably been scared to death by the bugs. She was fairly comfortable with most bug-type Pokemon but Viridian Forest had a way to drive people out of their comfort zones. I wouldn't mind that, Ash smiled, then frowned. You haven't tried to take any shortcuts, have you? I should have met you much earlier. If you've been following the main trail. I have, Leaf admitted, grinning as if proud of herself. I did find a shortcut, didn't I? She pumped her fist in the air and let out a series of giggles. You're an idiot, you know that. Ash's tone had a hint of sarcasm, but it wasn't devoid of truth. She could have easily found herself strayed in the wilderness, lost amidst the bugs and trees that weren't the most welcoming. He groaned as he sat back up. This girl never ceased to be adventurous. There's some time before sunset. We can still make some progress. Leaf rose up instantly in alarm. I am coming with you. Ash peered at her doubtfully. You'll slow me down so no thanks, he denied. A frolicking smirk hinged on the corners of his mouth, but he held it down. As he began to walk, Leaf grasped his wrist from behind, hauling him towards herself with all her force as she used him as support to rise. Do you really think I'll let you go? She pouted, then skipped in front of Ash. What if I die here? She tittered again, clutching his palm with both her hands. She knew him too well to not know Ash was joking. All right, Ash groaned, scratching his ear. But if you slow me down, I'll just leave you here. This meeting refreshed Ash's spirits. Not that he was down, but he always enjoyed his time with Leaf. Not everyone was here and it would have been a lot more fun if Gary was present. Or maybe not. He rolled his eyes as images of Gary flashed in his mind, particularly those of him acting cocky. And if I die in this forest because of that, I'll haunt you forever, Leaf giggled before she danced the next few steps. Oh boy, this could be fun but tiring. Ash watched as his Pokémon formed dark blue orbs of energy in their mouths, one of them being larger than the other. His Raining to teach Ignis and Kaiser Dragon Rage had gotten underway a few days back and they had made considerable progress since. Both of them could now summon the draconic energy required for the CK and would probably manage to execute the move well enough more times than not at this point. However, Ash believed that it would be best for them to concentrate on one thing at a time, charging up power for the move, before they tried to complete the attack. And that worked. Their training to just collect the energy for Dragon Rage instead of attempting to learn the attack completely made them adept at what they did. It would also help when they tried to learn a Dragon-type attack in the future. Both of them would exactly know how to focus and get the required amount of power if they practiced it long enough. He'd already figured that it wouldn't be a big deal for them to just fire off the attack. That would be similar to how Kaiser fired Dragon Breath and Ignis used Ember. He smiled happily as his Pokémon formed the orb again after letting go of the earlier one. Kaiser, being a dragon type and naturally knowing how to get that sort of energy, of course had the edge as his Dragon Age was somewhat bigger than the ball Ignis managed to form. However, Ignis wasn't far behind. Ash was surprised that he even managed to get that much dragon-type power so quick. Ignis, being a Charmander, did have dragon traits but it wasn't technically a pure dragon like Kaiser. Soon, he glanced at one of the trees where his Pidgeotto was perched up on. She too had been training and Ash had realized that she loved it. She didn't like to fall behind to her teammates and gave her all each time she trained. Ash had decided to just let her strengthen her current moves before he taught her another. Although he'd kept his eye on two moves that he wanted her to learn in the near future, Twister and Steel Wing. Those two moves would give her coverage against rock types that she needed, just in Ace she was pitted against one and didn't have a choice but to fight. The training his Pokémon had gotten and the experience he'd gained from fighting off multiple Beedrill throughout as well as Ling trainers throughout their journey was something that would definitely help them. Most of the trainers he got to battle were ones which specialized in bug types and some who even lived in the forest. But he'd had his fair share of battles with trainers like himself and he'd gotten a chance to let all of his Pokémon participate and get a taste of what it would be like in their future battles, which were sure to be tougher than these. Hey Pidgeotto, Ash called out, raising a hand towards his Pidgeotto. The flying type chirped and flew towards Ash, the flaps of her wings causing a weak twist. Tear of dirt and grass as she landed in front of her trainer. Would you like a name? Ash received a chirp in response, the bird hoisting her wings. I guess that means yes. Ash cocked an eyebrow and grinned. Upon receiving another merry coo from Pidgeotto, Ash let out a laugh. I've been thinking of one for you. How do you like Ava? The Pidgeotto tilted her head for a thoughtful moment before letting out another chirp along with a nod of her petite head. Ava it is then. Ash cheered and reached out a hand to pet Ava. She closed her eyes and basked in the love from her friend. Ash, came a sweet call from Leaf. Catching Ash's attention. Wanna have some stew I made? Ash nodded and smiled at his companion who joined him for his trip through Viridian Forest. Hey guys, he shouted towards his Ignis and Kaiser, who looked at him. Let's take a break. As told, Ava flew gracefully while Kaiser and Ignis ran behind their trainer who'd started walking towards their campsite. Hey there Petal, Poliwag. Ash waved to the two Pokémon of Leafs who cried in response to him. They were quite the friendly Pokémon he'd gotten to know after the time Leaf and he had spent traveling through the forest. Leaf had only named her starter, a Bulbasaur, Petal. Ash had to admit that the name suited Leaf's partner. It wasn't long before Ash and Leaf had their lunch while the Pokémon were all fed along with them. Over these past few days that they'd spent together, Kaiser and Ignis had gotten pretty close. Kaiser had started to get out of his shell and he didn't just attack anyone who he didn't like. Although the occasional dragon breath when he was agitated didn't vanish, he had taken quite well to the group. And the best thing was that he seemed to be enjoying it. Ash took a look at the Viridian Forest map and mused. We'll be exiting the forest pretty soon. Overjoyed at his last statement, Leaf, who sat next to him on the ground, crawled closer and glanced into the map herself. We're here. She pointed her finger to one of the points on the map and looked up at Ash. He nodded. Yeah, I see that your map reading skills have improved. He let out a chuckle at the pout that his brown-haired friend showed. When they'd started, she hardly could tell where they were, but she had definitely improved. So, Leaf began as she sat back straight. How long will it take for us to reach Pewter City? Ash looked up at the sky as he thought about the answer. I think we should be able to leave Viridian Forest by tomorrow, and then, he paused as he wondered how long it could take for them to travel through Route 2, the path between Viridian Forest and Pewter City. Maybe it'll take us another 2 days from there to get to Pewter City. I am not sure about the time it would take us to cross Route 2. He admitted with a wry smile. Leaf slumped her shoulders. That long, she groaned. They had been in this forest for over a week and it had definitely tired her out. Don't complain so much, Ash warned as he hid a titter behind his stare. If you ever say you're too tired and stall me, I'll simply leave you behind. You wouldn't. Leaf rolled her eyes before giggling. She knew this boy better than most and she had full faith that he would never leave her in a situation where she could find herself in danger. She knew how caring Ash could be, she'd experienced his kindness throughout the days they'd been friends, which was for as long as she could remember. The group had just finished their lunch, their stomachs full as they all snugly rested on the grass. The Pokémon too appeared to be having a rest as they sat under the warm sun, enjoying their time. Hey look, that's a Dratini. A voice shouted from one of the directions. The sound was loud enough that it had grabbed everyone's attention. Ash and Leaf turned towards where the cry came from and they found a man, a woman and a cat-like Pokémon with a golden coin on its head, approaching them. These guys appeared somewhat weird. The duo of Ash and Leaf noted. That was when Ash realized it. Are they Team Rocket? He frowned as he eyed their unusual clothes, which had one thing in common that would drag anyone's attention to it. There was a huge red-colored R painted on their vests. Team Rocket. Leaf cried in panic as soon as she heard Ash identify them. Are they really those guys? Their urgency was well justified. This was the same organization that had spread terror throughout Kanto and Johto in the past decade, and their work had simply grown. Rumors had it that they had been experimenting with various Pokémon amongst other things. They had managed to avoid the police so far, which just showed how efficient they were in what they did. These guys were bad news. That much was certain. Kaiser, Ignis, be ready. Ash alerted his two Pokémon. The grins on the faces of the two members of Team Rocket had him grow wary of them. He wasn't sure what they could throw his way, but he had to be ready. He was aware that they had started abducting Pokémon, especially the rare ones from trainers around the two regions. He had to be careful. "Hey kid," the man with blue hair called as he came to a stop a few feet from Ash. "Hand your Pokémon over to us." Ash didn't answer. He simply stared at them, fists clenched. This time the woman with crimson hair spoke, her tone stern and grave. "If you won't give us to them, we'll simply have to take them away from you by force." She got out a Pokeball and challengingly held it forth. "If you give us your Dratini, Charmander and Bulbasaur, we'll let you keep the other two." Ash and Leaf's eyes almost popped out and their mouths became agape. The Meowth, a Pokémon, had just spoken. They couldn't believe what they heard and only utter shock met them. As that same cat Pokémon smirked at them. It spoke. Ash mumbled in disbelief. He'd heard that a few Pokémon could use telepathy to converse with people, but those were very high-level psychic Pokémon. Not just had this Meowth talked, but it had talked through its mouth. This wasn't even telepathy. "That's absurd," he yelled. He still couldn't come to terms with the Meowth speaking. There was a few seconds of stalemate and absolute silence amongst them. Ash and Leaf's Pokémon growled at the three new figures who'd asked their trainers to surrender them. Kaiser hissed as he crawled forward. Eel Ignis pointed his claws and snarled at them in fury. Ava flapped her wings, showing that she was ready to take them on, while Petal and Poliwag too stood in front of their trainer, ready for a battle. The purple-haired man flipped his hair and showed off the rose he held in his hand. "I guess you leave us no choice," he spoke in a gentle voice before he grabbed a Pokeball from his pocket and raised it. Coughing. "Let's get this over with," he howled, almost in a bored tone. The woman with crimson hair and blue eyes shook her head. "How disappointed I am," she murmured and raised her own Pokeball to release her Pokémon. Ash and Leaf watched with bated breaths as the two Pokémon materialized on the ground. The one that emerged from the man's Pokeball was a purple, blob-like Pokémon that levitated in the air in front of its trainer. From the woman's ball came out a purple snake Pokémon that hissed and bared its fangs at the opposing Pokémon it saw. An Ekans and a coughing, Leaf recogni. Zed the Pokémon but got ready to battle soon. "Petal, are you ready?" she inquired and received an answer with an earnest cry from her starter. The Pokémon that had materialized had Ash think about a quick strategy. If these guys were really the vicious Team Rocket that had evaded the police for so long, this could be a really tough battle for him. He inhaled and closed his eyes before snapping them open at once. He was ready. "Kaiser. Dragon breath on the Ekans," he ordered before giving off another command. "Ignis, Ember at coughing. Razor Leaf on them, Petal." Leaf cried. "Let's show these pathetic twerps why you don't mess with Team Rocket." The pink-haired woman yelled as the look in her eyes changing into one filled with fire. "Ekans, Poison Sting. Coughing, use Sludge on those weaklings, Pokémon," the man ordered while the Meowth sneered and just watched the battle unfold. Draconic energy formed inside his mouth as Kaiser began to charge for Dragon Breath, and a few flames formed inside Ignis, Maw. The greenish-blue energy from Kaiser headed at Ekans while the flames of Ignis were aimed at the coughing. The Ekans reared his head back to launch a flurry of purple stingers for Ward while coughing fired a dark blue stench of poison. The Ember took out coughing's sludge while the Dragon Breath annihilated the poison sting that were headed and then stung into Ekans, who gave out a cry. The blast that had formed due to the collision of Sludge and Ember too did damage to Coughing, who was too close to the explosion. Just as the two Pokémon of Team Rocket thought they might get a breather, several sharp and pointy leaves revolved around Leaf's Bulbasaur and headed straight for them. They cut the two Pokémon like knives and left more bruises on them than they had already suffered. But those two poison types were far from done. They both glared at their opponent and shot the same attacks again. How did they recover so fast? Ash breathed out in shock. Both his Pokémon had been skewered by some of Ekans' poison sting while Petal took minor damage from Sludge. Although, this first round had the Team Rocket members grit their teeth in rage. "You have done it now, kids," the woman cried angrily. "Bite that Dratini and get your revenge." The man, although calmer than the woman, was in no less anger. Coughing, poison gas all around them. Neither Ignis or Kaiser took long to recover after the poison sting. They braced themselves to fight back as Ekans crawled through the ground and covered the distance between itself and Kaiser while coughing bald and suddenly purple. Poisonous smoke emerged from the holes in its body. Ash though, remained confident in his Pokémon now that he had seen that his Pokémon were superior. Blow that poison gas with gust. He ordered to Ava and she did just that. The avian flapped her wings furiously, creating a vicious tornado of dust and grass that blew away all the poison gas that had been released from coughing back towards them. Kaiser didn't even need an order from his trainer to fight off the Ekans that headed towards him with an open jaw and sharp fangs dangerously pointed. The orb of blue energy formed in his mouth in almost no time before he fired off his dragon rage for the first time. The blue beam of draconian energy swept everything including the grass in its path before striking Ekans and leaving it in massive amount of injuries. Use your dragon rage on coughing, Ignis. Ash shouted for what he intended to be the finishing blow in this encounter with Team Rocket. The same blue orb of dragon-type power that he'd practiced so many times formed in Ignis' mouth before he aimed it right at the coughing. The poison blob Pokémon had little time to react before the attack bathed him in burns and bruises. It collapsed on the ground and showed no signs of further movement. The Team Rocket member had been stunned. They thought that they could easily defeat this duo of kids and take their Pokémon away, but they had been proved wrong. They didn't even move for moments while their Pokémon lied on the ground unconsciously. These kids are strong, the strange Meowth said, narrowing his eyes. The purple-haired and recalled his fainted Pokémon in its Pokéball before shooting off a glare in Ash's direction. You've proved quite strong this time, but if we meet next time, it will be your doom. The woman too, T her Pokémon back in its Pokéball before she spat out furiously. You damn kids won't get away with this. After turning around to leave, she spoke one last time. We are the Team Rocket trio of Jesse, James and Meowth. Remember those names because we will be the ones to annihilate you next time we meet. And with those words, the three simply strode off in the direction they came from. They were in the forest in a few seconds and everyone lost sight of the three. Relief ran through his body as Ash sighed. What a pain, he groaned. I wonder if they really were Team Rocket. They weren't even all that strong. Leaf nodded in agreement. Yeah, but we did have a lot more Pokémon than them, so we had the advantage. Quote. Ash rolled his eyes as his forehead wrinkled. Whatever, let's just get going. Team Rocket or not, he didn't care. As long as he was able to fend them off without much trouble, he didn't really care. Ash and Leaf had walked for another day into the forest, getting ever so closer to the exit. They had just had their meal and resumed their trek when Ash came across something that caught his interest. What's that? Ash shouted in alarm as he saw something just around the bushes. With a frown, Ash took quick steps towards the bush with a hand on one of his Pokeballs. As the bush hustled again, he let Ignis emerge from his Pokeball, who yelped before he saw Ash looking gravely towards the trees and bushes at the side of the road. Leaf followed after Ash, but an extended hand told her to stay still. Use Ember. Ash instructed his fire type and pointed towards the direction where he heard the noise. Flames burst out from Ignis' mouth and headed in the direction where Ash told him to fire it. But just before one of the trees was caught in the ember, an insectoid Pokémon with primarily green-colored body, scythes for its hands and thin yet strong wings flew and dispersed the fire with the help of its scythes. Although Ignis' attack wasn't as weak as to not even cause damage to the Pokémon that fought it off, is made clear by the grimace and cry that left that Pokémon's mouth. A Scyther. Ash gasped in surprise. He hadn't come across one so far in their trip through Viridian Forest, and he had thought that he would never see one except for the one that Leaf chased after. A smirk appeared on Ash's face as he readied himself. Let's catch it, Ignis. There was a gleeful look on Ignis' face as well. Not only was the prospect of having this Scyther as a teammate was what that enthralled him, but a battle with a strong Pokémon like that was something he wanted to have. He growled at the Scyther, who fizzed back at him and dangerously pointed its scythes at him. He remained unfazed, though. He'd been through a lot to be scared of mere Pokémon now. Leaf's eyes almost bugged out at something she spotted. That's the same Scyther that I came across, she shouted, pointing her finger at the Scyther's leg. I can tell by the scar it has on its leg. And indeed, just as Leaf pointed out, there was a small yet seeped scar on the Scyther's right leg. I hope you don't mind me catching it, he claimed, but Leaf didn't even bother to answer. Use Ember again, Ash ordered. Hot orange flames shot across from Ignis, mouth and Scyther did what it had done just a while ago. It dispersed the flames but took damage from the super effective move. Suddenly, it flew across and almost disappeared, instantly appeared in front of Ignis and tackled it. That's quick attack. Ash gritted his teeth at the sight of Ignis taking some damage. Metal claw while it's close. Ignis' claw glowed silver and became harder than steel. With the power that could break even boulders, he swiped the Scyther that was too close to dodge the attack. It flew to the off-R side before it wailed at the damage that it had taken on the abdomen. Ember again, Ash ordered sharply. He'd come up with a basic strategy to use range attacks when the Scyther was away while using physically damaging attacks when it was close. As Ignis fired another series of flames at the Mantis Pokémon, it used its speed and agility to fly up. Soon enough, its wings shone and became sharper as it descended at Ignis. The fire type managed to let out a few more flames right before the Scyther could hit it, but the Scyther fought through the pain to complete its wing attack. The last move had done considerable damage to the Charmander as well as Scyther. Both of those Pokémon had a few bruises and in Scyther's case, burns on their bodies as they panted heavily, clearly on the edge of their strengths. However, only a grin crossed Ash's face. The sheer strength that this Scyther showed was something that Ash amazed. Even against a type disadvantage, it fought on equal terms with Ignis. It was a high-level bug type. Ash discerned that it was now time to end this battle and have that Scyther for himself. Dragon Rage, he called before his eyes bogged out in surprise. Wait, Ignis. The draconic energy of the Dragon Rage had just began to form inside of Ignis, when he was called to stop, which he did. The cries of the Pokémon that had just appeared out of the area that the Scyther defended had made Ash to have another thought at what he was about to do. Emerging from the bushes were two small Scyther that rushed towards the Scyther that Ash was aiming to capture. Ash ched with a realization as Scyther hissed to the two small ones and shielded them by standing in front of them. Ash sighed in disappointment. I can't do that. That would be just cruel. He just now realized why the Scyther had decided to fight off the Ember instead of dodging it, which it was easily capable of. It was just protecting its children. Return Ignis, you did well. He raised Ignis, Cabal, who was sucked inside his ball in a flash of red light. Leaf walked and stood next to Ash while gazing at the three Scyther. Yeah, those little ones won't survive without their mother. Ash was quick to get out a potion from his backpack and walk towards the Scyther. Just as he approached the Scyther, she stared at him and buzzed threateningly. She clearly wanted Ash to stay away, but the teenager knew better. In that injured state, she would have a hard time protecting its children, and even if he got a scratch or two in healing the Pokémon, he didn't mind. Don't worry, Scyther, the amberi-eyed boy assured the Pokémon with a calm smile. I won't hurt you. This'll make you feel better. He slowly bent down and extended the hand in which he held the potion near Scyther. The two little ones hid themselves behind their mother and only peeked out when nothing came their way for a few moments. The Scyther though didn't stop its fizzing. She wouldn't let anyone come near her or her kids. However, Ash collected the courage and slowly sprayed the potion over the wound that Ignis had given her with his metal claw. At the burning sensation that she felt, Scyther closed her eyes and wearily slashed the air with her scythes. Luckily for Ash, he was far enough to just be out of the range of the scythes. That had made his heartbeat rise. He was close to being slashed. As a few seconds passed, the Scyther calmed down and her eyes suddenly opened. She looked at the injury where Ash had applied the medicine, and while the injury was still there, the pain had considerably lessened in a matter of seconds. She just gazed at Ash with wide open eyes, wondering what magic this strange boy had done. See, Ash said before he advanced a step and sprayed some of the healing potion at the burns that her side had. As the Scyther just sat there without attacking him, he sprayed the potion at the remaining visible injuries as well. You'll feel better soon. Just take it easy for the day. Next, Ash dug into his backpack and got some Pokémon food out of it. He steadily placed it in front of the three Scyther. That's some Pokémon food specially made for bug types. I am sure you'll like it. He'd bought some bug-type specialized food in Viridian Forest to feed the bug-type Pokémon he might have caught, but since that hadn't happened, he figured it would be better to let these guys have it. As he stepped back and rose up, The two little Scyther had begun to sniff the Pokemon food that he placed, and in no time, they had taken a liking to it and began eating it. Their mother joined them soon enough, and she too appeared to have liked it. Ash smiled gently and waved at the Scyther, an act which was followed by Leaf before they continued on in their journey. Well, he might not have been able to catch the Scyther, but at least he had a good battle. But he was really happy because of the fact that he was able to help a Pokemon, and considering that it was his own fault to fight that Scyther in the first place. He felt as if it was his duty to set things right. Helping Pokemon was something he would never stop doing. Finally, they had reached the end. After long and tiring days of traveling through the deep forest which was Viridian, Ash and Leaf now finally breathed the outside air. The Viridian forest had brought them many challenges, from trainers to Team Rocket, from Beedrill to the Scyther. But they had managed to fight off and complete their trip through the biggest forest in the region of Kanto. Now, they stood at a road which wasn't completely surrounded by gloomy reason, where there were a number of different Pokemon than a multitude for bug types. We're finally outside. Leaf spoke in a relieved tone, eyes containing sheen that showed how amazing she felt outside. She looked at the sky and closed her eyes to get a feel of how life outside Viridian Forest would treat her. Ash smiled as he glanced at his excited friend. We definitely are. He too was relieved to be outside. He had gotten to get a lot out of his journey through the daunting forest, but they had been in for so long that being outside felt awesome. The trees inside the Viridian Forest were just different. They were a habitat for bug-type Pokemon, and their silence did feel creepy at times. Should we continue now? Leaf asked curiously. It was evening, but there was still time till sunset, so her question was valid. Ash's reply was instant. Yeah, we can still travel for another few hours. We have to make it quick so that we can reach Pewter City by tomorrow. A nod came from Leaf along with an agreeing smile. Let's go then. She skipped a few steps, taking a lead on Ash, who simply shook his head at the girl's excitement. Another 2 days' journey and the duo had reached Pewter City, also known as the City of Boulders. Just a look at the city from here told them how different this was from any other city or town they had come across. Many of the houses they could see from the entrance were made up of rocks instead of the newly cemented ones. There were quite a number of cemented buildings that came into their sight as well, which was because of the recent development. Tear City wasn't the fully boulder-made city that it was until a few years back, but there still remained some rocky houses which showed their culture. They were tired after their long trip and headed straight to the Pokemon Center. There, they had got their Pokemon healed up and then rented only one room. That was something which Ash at first wasn't too comfortable with, but then agreed to since they would have different beds. He wouldn't want to be stuck with Leaf and him sharing the same bed. Many things could happen and he didn't want to think about the different possibilities. The sight of comfy beds brought glitter to their eyes as Ash and Leaf both jumped at the two beds in the room. The amazing feeling of resting on a bed like this had evaded them for too long now, and they wanted to get a good, long feel of it again. Especially Leaf. It wasn't that she hated her journey outside, but while sleeping, she preferred to sleep inside walls on a nice, warm bed. Finally, Leaf breathed out as she laid on the bed, her hands thrown wide on the bed in comfort. This is just so much better, isn't it? He shared the feeling. Sleep will definitely be better here. Even better if I could use you as my hug pillow. The girl muttered lowly as she looked at the pillow beside her. The little whisper was caught by Ash, although he couldn't hear what she'd said. Did you say something? He asked, an eyebrow raised. Leaf rolled her eyes and replied plainly. No, not at all. The two comfily laid on the bed for a few minutes, letting some of their exhaustion disappear. They really loved to rest on the soft and cozy bed instead of their sleeping bags after some time. The bed was just so much more pleasant. So, Leaf began and broke the long silence that had shrouded the room. Have you come up with a strategy for the gym battle? Ash opened his eyes and gazed at the ceiling. Pretty much. He turned his eyes to the girl on the bed beside his own. What about you? She didn't utter another word for a few more moments, just staring off in her train of thoughts. I am not sure if I want to participate in the Pokemon League. Her reply was one that had Ash sit up from his lying position in an instant. What do you mean? His mouth was open in shock of what Leaf had just unveiled. He'd always thought that she wanted to become a Pokemon trainer, and this was something to He never thought he would be hearing from her. Well, I was planning on becoming a trainer. Leaf turned to face Ash, still lying on the bed. But after I began my journey and fought a few Pokemon battles, I realized that it wasn't something that I enjoyed as much as you or Gary or some of the others. She explained. I did find battling to be fun at the start, but as I fought a few more trainers, I wasn't enjoying it as much. I don't know if I am passionate enough in battling. A few more seconds passed as Ash remained silent. He let the words that Leaf spoke sink in before he eventually nodded. I guess I'll have to take you off my rival list then. He smiled at her. He respected her decision. Everyone didn't like to battle with their Pokemon as much as he did, and he knew that there were many other things she could do. For Pokemon battles, yeah, the brunette said as she hugged one of the pillows. Have you decided on what you're gonna do then? He asked, clearly curious to what her choice would be. Now that she'd decided against being a Pokemon trainer. A Pokemon coordinator maybe. Maybe, she answered unsurely. I am not really sure about it right now. I think I'll just some time traveling and find something I love. I sure hope you do. He winked at her in glee. Or else you'll be left behind us. Come on, Ash, Leaf giggled. You know me better than that. I guess I do. As Ash stood in front of two massive doors that led to a fully rock-made gym, he closed his eyes. He had done all the preparations that he thought he needed to do. He already knew about T. He typed that pewter gym specialized in and had got the name of the gym leader from Nurse Joy. But most importantly, he had prepared his Pokemon to face rock-type Pokemon of the pewter gym. If there was one thing that his Pokemon were weak against at this point, it was rock types. He'd already decided on a strategy. Kaiser could use Aqua Jet, which would be his most lethal weapon in this fight, and Niz's Metal Claw would also be of great use. Those were the two Pokemon he'd decided to use against the gym leader, Brock. He couldn't even think of using Ava. She had no moves to counter her rock-type weakness. She didn't even have a move that would be normally damaging. Her normal and flying-type moves would do minimal damage, and she wouldn't be able to help him much in this match. After a long thought about his strategy once again, Ash calmly opened his eyes and approached the rocky doors. As he pushed them open, he realized that they were surprisingly easy to push considering their size. As he stepped in, a simple battlefield came into his sight, but what had his eyes watching was a tan-skinned young man, probably a few years older than Ash, wearing a green vest sitting on Boulder at the other side of the field. As he made his way inside the gym followed by Leaf, the man who was probably the gym leader closed the book he had been reading and looked up. Are you a challenger? He asked, his face retaining the same expression. Ash nodded. Yes, are you the gym leader? The tanned man simply stood up from his position and walked forward. I am Brock, the Pewter City gym leader. I am Ash Ketchum from Pallet Town, and I challenge you to a Pokemon battle for the Boulder badge. Ash called with confidence brimming in his tone. He'd done his research on his long-awaited first IAL gym battle, and he was sure that the preparation he'd done would reap rewards. I accept your challenge, Ash Ketchum. Brock said before he brought forth a Pokeball. If you are here to watch the match. He shifted his gaze to Leaf, who stood by Ash's side. Then you should watch it from up there. Leaf obliged and walked to where Brock pointed, and right then, a young boy, similar looking to Bro. CK appeared and stood between the battlefield in the referee zone. This Pewter City gym match between Brock, the gym leader, and Ash, the challenger, will be a 2-on-2 battle. He voiced the rules. ND waited for Ash to give a nod of affirmation, which he did. Only the trainer will be allowed to substitute Pokemon. Begin, he shouted as he raised the only flag in his hand. Geodude, come forth for battle. Brock roared as his Pokeball snapped open and a gray-colored Pokemon with a boulder-like face and two hands materialized. The Pokemon shrieked as it looked down at Ash and waited for his opponent to be chosen. A Geodude to start, huh? Ash mumbled and unclipped one of his 3 Pokeballs from his belt. You're up, Ignis. With his claws pointed at his opponent, Ignis took to the field and cried, ready for battle. You're brave to use a fire type against my Geodude, Brock said gravely. His voice contained no form of jest whatsoever. From just taking a look at the Geodude, Ash could tell that it had been raised well. This wasn't going to be an easy battle, not with Ignis being at the disadvantage that he was. Ash had to be careful here. He'd already realized that this gym match would be his toughest battle on his journey yet. Ignis, Metal Claw, Ash commanded. He wasted no time to call for the move that he supposed would be the most effective from Ignis, Arsenal against rock types. Rock Throw, came Brock's own command. Ignis ran forward, and just as he did, his claws became a little larger and shone with metallic energy. As he charged, Geodude jumped up and then smacked the ground with one of its fists. The ground shook before the rocks that had risen from it made their way towards Ignis. The fire type though was ready as he managed to fight off all the rocks with the help of his metal claw. However, that meant Geodude could retreat and he wouldn't have the time to strike his original target. Now magnitude, Brock called out loudly. Ash gritted his teeth at that move. This was something Ignis wouldn't be able to avoid. But he still had one move that could help him in this situation. Quickly use Dragon Rage on the ground. You can't take damage from that move, he cried alarmingly. As a brown aura covered Geodude's body, Ignis formed a draconic blue orb of energy in his mouth. Right when Geodude slammed his entire body on the ground, Ignis did as he told and fired the blue beam on the ground. The ground shook at the power of the magnitude and it caused Ash to almost lose his balance. But he stood his ground, just like Ignis had managed to avoid this super effective move. Ash grinned. Awesome, Ignis. Brock was left speechless from the tactic Ash had pulled off to avoid magnitude. He couldn't believe that the Charmander was now flying by firing off his Dragon Rage on the ground. Whose power had let for him to gain flight? He came back to his senses when Ignis jumped back onto the ground, but the magnitude had already stopped by then. That was quite skillful, I must say. Brock complimented with an ever so slight smile. But simply evading these attacks won't get you anywhere. Geodude used Rock Throw. What Brock just said was true and Ash knew that. Ignis, two attacks that would do the most damage to Geodude were Metal Claw and Dragon Rage. And for them to hit, he might have to let Ignis take a hit or two. Dragon Rage, Ash called, his mind completely driven by the battle he was in. Make sure it gets to Geodude. Like earlier, Geodude had already slammed its fist into the earth to cause some rocks to fly in front of it, which eventually headed for Ignis. But Ignis was ready. He fired off the dragon-type move in Geodude direction and that meant that he couldn't avoid the incoming rocks. He cried off in pain of the rocks, striking him on various spots, but Geodude also suffered considerable damage from his Dragon Rage. He'd worked hard on it and he wouldn't want his opponent to get away with only minor damage from that move. That's quite a strong Dragon Rage, Brock mused with a satisfied smile. He didn't come across trainers who would put up a good show using their fire types too often. It seems like we'll have to use it. Roll out. That move made Ash's eyes widen. He got himself back when the Geodude curled itself into a ball and began to roll fiercely towards Ignis. Fight it off with Metal Claw. When the rolling Geodude was close enough, Ignis slashed it with his steel-like claws. The Geodude though wasn't fazed much as it simply rolled back even after taking the damage. Ash narrowed his eyes when he realized that Brock would be continuing with the same move. And he knew that tactic. Rollout's power increased as the Pokémon using the move gained momentum, and the longer Geodude charged, the stronger the damage it would do. As the Geodude neared Ignis again, Ash shouted, "Metal Claw again." And just like before, Ignis' silver claws slashed onto the Geodude who rolled. But the stronger move had shed Ignis back even though his Metal Claw was successful. Ash gritted his teeth. This could get bad for him. Geodude had taken considerable damage from the Dragon Rage and the Metal Claw that Ignis hit it with, but it showed no signs of stopping its rollout. And the power of the move kept on increasing. Ignis could be in trouble. Dragon Rage now, Ash shouted, desperation evident in his tone. Right when Geodude closed in on him again, Ignis formed the blue orb of draconic energy in his mouth before he shot it off at Geodude, who was no more than 2 feet away. The Dragon Rage burned into it and almost stopped its rollout. Almost. The bolder Pokémon though, fought through the many bruises that it had suffered and kept on rolling and struck Ignis, whose eyes widened as he was struck right in the gut. The super effective move left Ignis let out a loud grunt while Geodude kept rolling and crashed into one of the walls of the gym. Ignis, eyes closed as he collapsed on the ground and showed no movement. He had fainted, but he had taken his foe with him. Geodude didn't seem like it would get up either. The boy acting as the referee glanced between the two Pokémon before he raised both his hands. Both Geodude and Charmander are unable to battle. With a sigh, Brock raised his Geodude's Pokeball and recalled the Pokémon. He mumbled some words of praise to his rock type before he smiled as he shifted his gaze to Ash again. I have to commend you, Ash. To have to take out my Geodude with a fire type like Charmander, you have trained your Pokémon well. Ash called Ignis back before he replied. Thanks. He unclipped his second's Pokeball and smirked at Brock. This next battle will be much quicker. Brock raised an eyebrow in amusement to Ash's confident comment. You seem pretty confident in your next Pokémon. Well, he is my starter and he doesn't have a weakness to rock types like Ignis did. Ash replied with a defiant expression on his face. As the referee threw his hands up, the energy beamed from both the sides of the field. The Pokémon that stood in front of either of the trainers resembled snakes. But the biggest difference could be seen in their size. One towered almost 30 feet from the ground and while the other was hardly 5 feet long. On Brock's side had materialized a Pokémon which had a body made of chains of rocks and a gray horn on its head. Eat Pokémon roared out before slamming its tail on the field, the debris rising from the ground. Well, this'll be good. Ash smirked as he eyed the massive Onix that Brock had chosen. His look changed to one of determination soon enough though. Kaiser, Dragon Breath. At first, Brock was quite amazed at the Pokémon Ash had chosen. A Dratini wasn't a Pokémon one laid eyes on every day and he was deaf. Innately impressed by the Dratini that looked to be in the best shape it could be. Ash's call had brought him back to his senses as he yelled. Rock Thoru. A greenish-blue beam of draconic energy ejected itself in Kaiser's mouth while Onix slammed its tail on the ground once again, this time with much more power which was enough to cause the ground to shake. The rocks that rose from the ground air aimed to do damage to Kaiser but he was sharp. Sharp enough to blow them all away with his dragon breath before firing another one. The back-to-back attacks had taken Onix by surprise and it couldn't move out of the way in time. The massive rock type balled out at the first damage it suffered in the match. Brock was impressed yet again. This Dratini wasn't simply in good shape, it had a lot of power as well. To take advantage of the lead he'd gotten, Ash yelled to his Pokémon. Aqua Jet. Brock's eyes widened at the call of that move. At first he thought that it might be a bluff but his ours came true when Kaiser's body became surrounded in a veil of water. Iron Tail to fight it off. Kaiser launched himself at Onix, body covered in blue water that swirled around at amazing speed and struck the huge Pokémon with the super effective move. The water spilled around the point of impact and caused massive amounts of damage to Brock's Onix as signified by the cry of agony that it gave out. It wasn't going to give up so easily though as its tail shone silver and metallic aura swirled around it. It fought the pain, slammed its iron tail down at Kaiser, crashing the dragon type on the ground. Kaiser, hang in there. Ash shouted out in concern for his starter. That iron tail had done a lot of damage to Kaiser but he knew he needed to remain calm. He took a deep breath and then gave out another order. Dragon Rage right at it. Rock Tomb. Brock commanded, slipping into the intensity of the battle. The Pokémon on the field breathed heavily, they both had suffered some damage and they realized that the battle was on its last stage. As the commands from their trainers came, they both began to charge for their attacks. Kaiser formed the draconic blue ball in his mouth while Nyx summoned several stones around its head that had gained a silver outline. At once, they let their attacks rip. Kaiser's Dragon Rage was the first to strike and send Onix tumbling on the ground. Onix's Rome Tomb landed on its mark too, all the rocks crashing into Kaiser who let out cries of pain as the flurry of rocks that smashed into his skin. Ash and Brock gritted their teeth. This has been one intense battle and much tougher than either of them previously imagined. Brock as well as Ash thought they would win this round much comfortably, without it ever coming to this point. However, they both smirked as they glanced at one another. No matter what, this had been one amazing battle and they both acknowledged that. Though, Ash knew that he had this in the bag. Let's finish this. Aqua Jet. A shaky Kaiser recovered himself and locked his eyes at his target before his body surrounded itself into a swirling jet of water. Onix had just gotten back a little bit, its eyes widened. Kaiser smashed into it with its Aqua Jet. The massive rock snake Pokémon roared one final time before it collapsed on the ground, its huge weight causing the entire ground to tremble. But that was the last thing Onix did. It had run out of energy as it laid on the gym floor unconscious and with no movement. Kaiser gave into his exhaustion and collapsed on the ground too, but he was still very much able to battle. He had won an amazing battle. The kid acting as the referee shook himself out of the shock of Brock's Onyx being defeated when its opponent was not a water or grass type. Almost all of the victories that trainers got against Brock's Onyx was because they had a huge type advantage against it. Onyx is unable to battle. The winner of this round and the gym battle is the challenger. The tanned boy raised the only flag in his hand towards Ash and declared, "You were awesome, Ash." Leaf ran from where she'd been told to watch and chimed, getting a grin in response from Ash. The victorious trainer though had taken his Dratini in his arms and began to pet him. "That was amazing, Kaiser," he complimented with a gentle smile. The response from Kaiser was nothing but a hiss before he curled himself around and closed his eyes. "Take a rest." With those words, Ash tapped Kaiser with his Pokeball and let his starter get a well-deserved rest in his Pokeball. On the other side of the field, Brock had rested his fallen Pokemon in its Pokeball as well. The gym leader walked across with a genuine smile on his face. "You're a really good trainer, Ash," he commended the young man who he now stood in front of. Ash chuckled at the praise of the gym leader. "Thanks, Brock. I thought I would have an easier time with my Dratini than I did." "Your Pokemon are quite strong too." Brock nodded. Dead before he dug into his pocket and removed an octagonal gray-colored stone that shone. He held the stone-like gym badge forward. "You've truly earned the Boulder Badge, Ash." With eyes glittering, Ash gladly accepted the Boulder Badge from Brock. He gazed at it in absolute joy. He'd earned his first official gym badge. He'd battled with his own Pokemon and thoroughly won against his opponent in a battle that had gotten to wire. The joy he felt was indescribable. The Pokemon that he had trained on his own, the Pokemon that he had caught had won him his first ever gym battle. This was a moment that he would cherish, and he was sure his Pokemon would too. "Are you sure you'll be alright?" Ash asked the brunette in front of him. He was concerned about Leaf and how she would do traveling alone. After the way she met him in the Viridian Forest, he was right to be worried. She could get herself into a load of trouble. Leaf had decided that she wanted to spend some more time in Pewter City, visiting the museum in the city of boulders. That, she said, would also give her some time to think about what she needed to do. She thought that it would be best to have her goal in mind before she advanced any further. She wanted to know what she would want to do before she traveled through the region. Even though Ash was worried about her doing that, he agreed with her. There was no point in going around Kanto from city to city if she wasn't sure what she would like to be. It could be difficult for her to think about her goal while she traveled, and much easier if she stayed at one place. She would also have access to exploring a few things she could do. She'd already told him that she did have a few things in mind that she wanted to try out. Ideally, Ash would have liked for Leaf to be a trainer like him. He'd always thought that he, along with Gary and Leaf, would be able to compete against each other as Pokemon trainers. But that wasn't to be. Although he was happy that Leaf followed what her heart told her to instead of simply continuing as a Pokemon trainer like she had intended. When he thought if he might face a situation like that, he felt the chills. He didn't even want to think about him being anything but a Pokemon trainer. Unlike Leaf, he enjoyed training and battling alongside his Pokemon the most. That was his undying passion, and it had been since his early childhood. He'd always had a one-track mind about that matter. "Yeah, Ash," Leaf nodded and grinned at Ash. "It's nice to know that you are actually worried about me though." "Well," he began, and took his Z away from Leaf as his cheeks turned the slightest hue of red. "I do care about you, somewhat." He was never good at these things. He would never come out and admit just how much he cared about his friends. He was the type to hide such feelings instead of showing them to everyone. "Somewhat, huh?" Leaf leaned forward, her hands on her hips. She couldn't help but giggle when Ash tried to avoid her stare though. "It's good to hear that you do, at least," she muttered as she stood back straight and her tone turned sweeter. "What are you gonna do, then?" Ash gave her a quizzical look. "Are you gonna stay here in Pewter City or go back to Viridian?" Putting a hand on her chin, Leaf thought about the question. "I'll stay in Pewter City for a while," she smiled as she brought her gaze back to Ash. "I am not too fond of traveling through Viridian Forest over and over again, you know." As expected, Ash chuckled and shook his head. There would barely be any girls he knew who would want to be in Viridian Forest more than they had to. It was bug-filled, and to his knowledge, most girls found them creepy. He could recall a few who wouldn't, but most of them would. I can't see you having the courage to do so. Instantly, Leaf pouted at the statement Ash made. What do you mean? She folded her arms and looked away. It's just that I don't feel like doing it, not that I am scared or anything. Ash furrowed an eyebrow, but soon his expression neutralized. I guess so. You're going to challenge the Cerulean Gym next, right? She questioned curiously. She was aware that Cerulean City, Washington, the closest city, and since Ash told him that he was going to make his way through Mt. Moon, Cerulean was the one that Ash would reach next. However, knowing Ash as well as she did, she couldn't quit. Be sure if he would go that way or simply go to another gym. She rolled her eyes when she realized that the chances of that happening were pretty low. Ash snapped her out of her train of thoughts with his answer. Yeah, that's the closest gym. Which other gym could I challenge before that? They had read about the gym around Kanto together, and Leaf knew that it was the next city, which made Ash wonder about the ridiculous question she'd asked. He clutched onto the strap of his backpack. Well, he started, turning around a little. I should be on my way now. Leaf's heart began beating faster at that moment. She didn't want to leave Ash now that they'd met in the Viridian Forest. But she understood that she didn't have a goal in mind, and she shouldn't be making Ash wait just because of her. She'd always known how important his journey was to Ash, and now traveling with him for a few days, she also learned how much training his Pokémon meant to him. She clasped her hands in front of her chest, her eyeballs growing. Take care, Ash, she whispered. Suddenly, she took her childhood friend by surprise when she embraced him, wrapping her hands around his shoulders and burying her face in his chest. Ash was taken aback by the abrupt hug that he received from Leaf. Soon enough though, he wrapped his own arms around the girl. You too, he said softly. He wasn't uneasy, but the grown breath of Leaf against his chest was something that he'd never noticed before. Leaf had hugged him many times in the past, but this was the first in a while. The last time she did, they were much younger. They remained that way for a few more moments before Leaf eventually stood back straight. She moved a few strands of hair from her face and gazed at Ash in the eyes. I might actually miss you, you know. A smile made its way to her pretty face. Ash's lips parted for a moment or two, unable to find the right words to speak. I hope you don't, he smiled back wryly at her. We might not meet for a while now. Don't be so negative. Leaf giggled in her usual tone. I am sure we'll meet soon. A lack of goal hasn't done anything to your optimism, I see, Ash smirked before he let out a chuckle. You can't get anything without having the motivation, Leaf said, raising a finger in front of Ash, which she then used to poke his nose playfully. Ash took a step back, not letting Leaf do any more poking to his face. That's true. I guess. The raven-haired teenager turned around and glanced at Leaf from his shoulder one last time. Best of luck, Leaf. I hope you don't wander into dangerous situations like you usually do. I won't, I promise, Leaf giggled and waved at her best friend. She was sad that he was leaving, but she decided to push that feeling away and look forward to what life held for her. She had a lot to think about her goal, after all. Next time she saw Ash, she wanted him to be impressed. A few hours had already passed since Ash left Pewter City to continue his journey. His next destination was Mt. Moon, and he currently strolled through the roads of Route 3, which was the route between Pewter City and Mt. Moon. So far, his walk had been rather uneventful, only encountering a few wild Pokémon which he didn't bother to disturb. A look at his watch told him that he should be taking a break soon. He had covered some distance and he did feel somewhat tired due to walking in the heat as well as making his way up the slope. However, he decided to trek a little more before he did take a break. He reckoned that he could walk for an hour or so more before really feeling any exhaustion. Right then, Ash's eyes found something that caught his attention instantly. That Pokémon. Ash narrowed his eyes at the sight of a white Pokémon with green hair that resembled a bowl cut. He ran towards the injured Pokémon that had two flat red horns, a large one at the front and a smaller one at the back. There were many bruises all around the Pokémon's body and blood dripped through some of the cuts. He grimaced when he realized how deep some of the cuts were. The Pokémon that Ash held in his hands still breathed, but it was evident that it wasn't in good shape. He put all the thoughts and questions that his mind held about the Pokémon aside for the time being. This Pokémon needed immediate attention. The first thing he did was quickly got out 2 potions. And wasted no time in spraying them on the wounds on the Pokémon's body. As he finished, he wondered about the question that had hovered in his head since the moment he laid eyes on the Pokémon. What's a Ralts doing here? He thought out loud about the psychic and fairy-type native to the Hoenn region that lied in front of him. This was a Pokémon that wasn't found commonly in the Kanto region. Ralts' line of Pokémon found it much comfortable to live in regions like Hoenn and Sinnoh, the former being the region that resided these Pokémon the most. Although, it wasn't completely weird for them to be spotted in Kanto. It wasn't too common. The other question that troubled Ash was why the Ralts was in such a condition. He could discern that it had been attacked by some wild Pokémon, but his species typically stayed away from conflicts. Or so he'd learned. He glanced back at the Ralts and placed a hand on the Pokémon's head. It didn't have a fever as Ash initially thought it did. The wounds were still there, but he could tell that its breathing had become much better than what it was a few minutes ago before he applied the potions. The potions wouldn't be enough to completely heal the Pokémon though. It needed to be taken to the Pokémon Center. He frowned when he realized that the Mt. Moon Pokémon Center was still far away. He'd have to do something else. He thought about it for a minute before he sighed. Deciding to do what was best. He would have to take the Ralts to the Pewter City Pokémon Center. He didn't want to go back there and make it all the way here again, but he had no other choice. The injuries that the little Pokémon had suffered were far too severe to be expected to heal on their own. He wasn't the best at medicine either, so he had to do it. He would wait a little while to let the Ralts recover a little from its injuries, however. A few more minutes had gone by, but the Ralts still remained unconscious. The blood had stopped coming out of its body. Though it looked a little bit better than before. Ash nodded to himself as he stood up. He wore his backpack that was on the ground and bent down to pick up the Ralts. Just as he was about to pick it up though, he heard someone calling. Tia, the voice shouted. The same voice screamed for the same name again, and this time, it appeared that the one that the voice belonged to was coming in his direction. Ash narrowed his eyes, looking in the direction that the shout came from. And soon enough, he could see a person, a young woman, running towards where he stood. The woman appeared as if she had seen him as well as the Pokémon that laid beside him as she scurried towards them as fast as she could, her eyes wide. Ash simply watched the fair-skinned blonde woman sit next to Ralts. The woman appeared worried, he noted. After a few seconds, the woman who looked as if she was in her late teens or early 20s turned her gaze to him. "Thank you for taking care of Tia," she flashed him a grateful smile. Although the expression of concern still remained dormant on her features. "You don't need to thank me," Ash said, taking a seat next to Ralts himself. He figured that the Ralts had been named Tia considering how the woman called it by that name. So, he furrowed his brow after he had a look at Ralts and looked up at the woman again. "Is this Ralts yours?" The woman instantly shook her head. "No," she denied. "Tia is not my Pokémon. Although it has been staying with me for about 2 months, she continued after Ash gave her a nod. "You see, I found Tia about 2 months ago. I was out picking some herbs when I stumbled across her in the forest. She was injured and she had bruises all over her body. In fact, she was in a similar condition as she is now." Ash wrinkled his forehead as he took what she said in his brain. In other words, the Ralts had a tendency to get into situations like this. That was completely different from what he'd read about the species. "So, you've been taking care of Ralts. I mean Tia, ever since then." The Pokémon was probably female as well since the woman referred to it as her. The woman nodded. "That's about right." Just then, Tia grunted and shifted itself on the ground. Its eyes still remained closed, but it appeared as if it was waking up. Although, it seemed in pain. The woman looked at the feeling Pokémon and quickly picked up the Ralts from the ground. "We need to treat her wounds. You can come with me, if you want," the woman suggested before she stood up with Ralts in her arms. Ash thought about it for a moment before he nodded. He was quite interested in the Ralts and he wanted to hear more about her. This Ralts was completely different from how he thought they acted, so it was definitely worth spending some time on. Besides, He would have been thinking about the condition the Ralts was in if he went on his way without being assured of how the Pokémon's condition remained. Tia looked much better, Ash observed. Shish. He was breathing much easier now and a lot of her injuries had been healed. He took a sip of his coffee and looked at the woman that had just taken a seat in front of him. After Ash followed the woman along with Tia to her house, she informed him that she made Pokémon medicine using herbs. He was quite impressed by the collection of herbal plants that Tasha, the woman that came looking for Tia, had outside her house. He didn't know much about the different herbal plants, but the variety was evident even to someone who would be ignorant to such things. The way Tasha treated Tia with the medicine she made from fresh herbs was also something Ash found quite fascinating. The medicine also showed quick effects, healing most of Tia's major wounds very quickly. The psychic type waking up and feeling better was a sign of the successful treatment. He'd wanted to leave soon after Tasha assured him that Tia would be completely recovered in about a day or two, but the blonde woman urged him to stay a while longer. She said she wanted him to have a rest and also show him some of her herbs as thanks for giving Tia some emergency treatment. The idea of learning more about the herbs that Tasha Gray compelled Ash, and he didn't take long to accept her offer. This was something that might just come in quite handy in his journey. Having a way to give some treatment to his Pokémon aside from the UAL potions and antidotes would be pretty good if he found himself in a dire situation with an injured Pokémon, be it his or wild or even someone else's. Tia's recovering well, Tasha commented in relief, a smile plastered on her face. Ash beamed at her. She is, he agreed. You'd make quite a good doctor. At the comment Ash made, Tasha first blinked for a few seconds before she laughed at the suggestion. No, she waved her hands in front of her face. I am good at growing these herbs and making a few medicines, but I can't be a doctor. You treated Tia well enough, so why can't you? Ash asked, taking another sip of the amazing coffee that Tasha gave him. Making those little medicine is just something you learn when you do what I do all the time, she said. It's no big deal really. You're too modest. Ash chuckled and shook his head. Your talent is just wasted here. You could grow these herbs somewhere close to the city and be a doctor. I really mean it. No, you're just too polite. She giggled cheerfully and glanced at Tia, who appeared to be fast asleep. Anyway, Ash, I was wondering, she began, her gaze fixed at the floor before she brought it back to Ash. Would you mind taking Tia with you? Ash frowned at the offer that Tasha proposed. He wasn't quite sure how to answer it. It would be amazing to have Tia with him, but he couldn't understand the reason why Tasha would suddenly tell him to take her out of the blue like this. Even though he would love to have Tia as his Pokémon, he was also skeptical whether Tia would even come with him after staying with Tasha. He could tell how much Tasha cared for Tia, and he was sure that she must have been attached to her just as much. What do you mean? Ash finally mouthed. Tasha stood up and walked up to the bed. Here the psychic and fairy-type Pokémon rested. Would you mind having Tia as one of your Pokémon? She asked as she petted the Pokémon concerned. As she didn't receive an answer from Ash, she turned her eyes to him. You see, Ash, this is not the only time this has happened to Tia after I found it. She explained seriously. Oftentimes, she just disappears from the house. Sometimes, she comes back safe, but more often than not, she's injured or poisoned. I have never seen her fight a Pokémon before, but she just keeps on getting these injuries. I don't want this to happen to Tia anymore. She gazed at Ash in the eyes and clasped her hands together in front of her chest. So please, Ash, take her with you. Now, Ash was sure that something was weird about this Ralts. No Pokémon would want to get into trouble and get beaten up. I would be happy to have Tia as my Pokémon, but, he sighed and continued. But I am not sure if she will come with me. Come with you. Tasha tilted her head. I don't want to force her to come with me if she wants to stay here. I just won't feel like Tia will be happy that way, he put forth his thoughts. But that's not important, that Tia's safety. Tasha all but shouted. She inhaled, calming herself down as she stepped towards Ash. Even I want Tia to stay here, but I can't protect it. Please, Ash, she requested, her expression displaying just what she meant. Do it for Tia, for her safety. Quote. Ash knitted his eyebrows. All right, he said as a gentle smile crept up to his face. Tia would be an amazing addition to his team, although he just wasn't quite sure if that would be the best for her. However, Tasha's words had convinced him enough. I will take Tia with me. Thank you, Tasha sighed in relief. Even though she would have liked for Tia to be with her. She knew that this was the best thing for her. She had only known Ash for 2 days, but the way he acted towards his own Pokemon and the way he took care of Tia were more than enough proof for her to trust him with the Ralts. Tia glanced at Tasha and then shot a quizzical look to Ash. She gazed at Ash for another minute before letting out a coo, which too sounded confused. She had Almos. T completely recovered and just woken up completely a few hours ago. And suddenly, she was told by Tasha to go with Ash instead of staying with her. This all confused the little feeling Pokemon and Shish. He didn't have any idea what to do or what to even make of the situation. Tia cried and looked at Tasha, her visible eyes almost tearing up as she jerked her head at the blonde girl. She jumped into open arms of Tasha and buried her face into her bosom. She cooed a few times as she clutched tightly onto Tasha. The Heian native Pokemon had become attached to her and she didn't want to leave her side. But Tasha practically begged her to go with Ash, and after some resistance, she had accepted. Ash watched the two embrace each other with a warm smile on his face. He was quite astonished that Tia had accepted coming with him so easily, even if it was something Tasha told her. He'd expected her to resist more, and even the scene in front of him showed how close the two had gotten. He could make out that Tia didn't want to make Tasha worry because of herself. The two eventually parted, Tia still hanging onto Tasha's skirt as the girl stood back up. Take care of Tia, Ash, Tasha said with a smile. Her expression clearly showed that she didn't want to part with the Ralts. Ash nodded firmly at what Tasha had just told him. I will, Tasha. You don't have to worry about Tia at all. Asha picked up Tia in her arms and kissed her on the forehead. Be a good Pokemon and don't cause too much trouble for Ash, okay? She whispered to Tia, who nodded twice. And don't get into any trouble, alright? Tia nodded again and hugged her face. She didn't really like the prospect of being without Tasha either. An empty Pokeball was already clutched tightly in Ash's hand as Tasha walked forward with Tia in her arms. She whispered a few things to Tia and embraced her once more. Then, she looked at Ash and nodded. Ash sucked his teeth together and raised the Pokeball that he intended to capture Tia in. Here we go. He mumbled and tapped the little Ralts that had been gazing at him for the last few moments with the Pokeball. The feeling Pokemon was sucked into a red flash of light, disappearing from Tasha's arms. The Pokeball shook a few times in Ash's hands before it made a ping sound and stopped shaking. Both Ash and Tasha knew what that meant. Tia had shown no resistance to the capture and she now had become one of Ash's Pokemon. The excitement of catching a new Pokemon was already pumping Ash's blood. The fact that it was a Pokemon not commonly sighted in the Kanto region made it all the more special. He hadn't expected to come across a Pokemon like Tia on his way to Mt. Moon, much less catch one. When he'd found the injured Ralts, catching her was the last thing on his mind. Tasha's heart too began beating faster. The friend that she'd made and the one that she'd cared about for the past 2 months would no longer be staying with her. She would feel lonely, upset even. However, that was for Tia's own good. The blonde understood that. A life with Ash would be much better for her than anything she could have provided her with. She almost knew in her heart that this was the right thing to do and also that it would be better for Tia. Take care of yourself and your Pokemon, Tasha said after she'd calmed herself down. She appeared a little upset as she played with her fingers behind her back. Ash attached Tia's Pokeball to his belt and grinned. I will, trust me, and I won't let anything happen to Tia. Best of luck in your journey, Tasha chimed in a cheerful tone. I do watch the Pokemon League matches from time to time and I will surely be watching you in the league. I guess I'll have to perform out of my skin if you're gonna be watching, Ash chuckled and Tasha laughed along with him. I better get going. Tasha pursed her lips together. Bye, Ash. She waved at the boy, who just turned around and started prodding. Bye. Ash waved back from over his shoulder as he continued his trek to Mt. Moon. That journey he knew was going to be very taxing and he would do good to get ready for it. Ash stood in front of the entrance to the Mt. Moon as he looked at the giant mountain that had no end. The mountain was massive and just looking at it from up close could have someone scared. Ash had come here once before, but that was many years ago when he was still a child. He didn't remember much about that visit now, and he noted that Mt. Moon looked nothing up close like it did from a distance. He'd been able to see the mountain for the last day of his travel through Route 3, but he didn't expect it to be so formidably massive. After he'd caught Tia and left Tasha's house, it had taken him 2 more days to get to Mt. Moon. He'd reached there the evening earlier and spent the night in the Pokemon Center just beside the entrance, deciding it would be best to start his journey through the massive mountain fresh in the morning. Along the way, he hadn't come across too many trainers or different Pokemon than the usual Nidoran, Pidgey, Spearow and Mankey, along with a few other commonly spotted Pokemon. He took a long breath inside and finally made up his mind to get through the biggest mountain in the region of Kanto. He took his first step inside and realized that the torch he'd brought along would come in very handy in this mountain. As the trainer made his way inside, he found that the sunlight that entered the caves had started to get less and less. There were lamps hanging from the ceiling that provided light. Although Ash knew better than to trust these lights, several of which were broken, the best thing to do would be to use his torch and be safe instead of trusting the light of Mt. Moon. This would be quite an experience, Ash remarked. Even more enthralling than the ones he had in Viridian Forest. The 4 Pokemon of Ash's, Kaiser, Ignis, Ava and Tia, happily ate the Pokemon food that their trainer put in front of them. Ignis and Kaiser especially enjoyed the food since the 2 of them had been training for the past couple of hours. Ava and Tia were surprised to say the least, seeing how the 2 devoured the food. They must have been through some really hard training, the 2 figured. Ash himself finished his lunch, a packed burger that he'd brought along. It had been 4 days since Ash had entered Mt. Mo. On to make his way to Cerulean City, and in those 3 days, he sure had found the experience in the mountain quite satisfying. He hadn't come across any rare Pokemon except for one Clefairy that he potted, which successfully got away before Ash had a chance to do anything, but the different caves that he'd gone through to reach where he was now was surely something he enjoyed, no matter how hard it had been. Along the way, he'd encountered several trainers and a few hikers. He battled a few of them, getting some training in for his Pokemon. He had been thinking about the gym battle that he would have in the Cerulean Gym. It was a water-type gym as he'd read, and he'd been wondering which Pokemon to use in there. His Kaiser would be his trump card, not only because it knew Shock Wave, an electric-type move that would do super effective damage to the water-type Pokemon of the Cerulean City gym leader, but also because it was a dragon-type. That meant that the water-type attacks of the gym leader's Pokemon wouldn't do a lot of damage to Kaiser. He had a complete advantage with that. The second Pokemon was something that he hadn't chose though. He wouldn't be using Ignis because of his weakness to water-type. Ava was the most logical choice, and he'd most probably be using her. But he'd been wanting to battle with Tia. He hadn't used the Ralts in any of his battles yet. He wanted the feeling Pokemon to get used to her life with a trainer before he did anything related to Pokemon battling with her. In fact, he hadn't let Tia out of its Pokeball many times yet. He considered how she got herself into trouble with wild Pokemon, so he knew that he had to keep an eye on her whenever she was out of her ball. As Tia peacefully ate her food, Ash scanned her with his Pokédex, raising the machine towards her. The Pokédex suddenly began to speak and obviously caught Tia by surprise, who at first frantically glanced at different direction to know where the sound came from before she realized that it was the machine that her trainer held which had suddenly spoken. Ralts, the feeling Pokemon. It senses the emotions of people using the horns on its head. This Pokemon rarely appears before people. But when it does, it draws closer if it senses that the person has a positive disposition. This Ralts is female. Its ability is Synchronize. It knows the moves Confusion, Draining Kiss, Double Team, Disarming Voice and Growl. Ash raised an eyebrow and flashed a smile at Tia a second later. "You've got quite a moveset, Tia," he complimented, in reply to which, Tia could only blush. The ability Synchronize will be useful as well. He kept his Pokédex back inside his pocket after he had a look at the moves he could teach Tia. She could learn quite a variety of moves in her ability. Synchronize was also something that fascinated him. There weren't a lot of Pokemon with that ability, and it could come in handy in battles. It was an ability which passed on status effects such as Burn. paralysis or poison to the Pokémon that inflicted the condition on the Pokémon with the ability. Considering her moveset, she wouldn't be a bad choice to use against the Cerulean City gym leader. He shrugged to himself, just opting to choose his second Pokémon for the gym battle later. He still had to cross Mt. Moon before he could challenge the gym, so he had quite a bit of time to figure it out. "Would you mind healing my Pokémon, Nurse Joy?" Ash requested. He now stood in the Cerulean City Pokémon Center, having made his way through Mt. Moon, which took him almost 2 weeks, and then covering the distance between Mt. Moon and Cerulean City in less than a day. The pink-haired nurse of Cerulean City nodded her head as she brought out a tray and placed all of the 4 Pokeballs that Ash handed to her inside. She then called for her Chansey, who quickly healed all of the Pokémon and brought them back to the nurse in about a couple of minutes. "Here you go," Joy chimed sweetly as she handed the Pokeballs back to Ash. "All your Pokémon are completely healed up." Ash gave her a grateful smile. "Thanks, Nurse Joy." He took his Pokeballs and attached them back on his Pokeball belt before he looked up at the lady again. "I would also like to have a room. Or any available." Soon, Ash found himself in a room inside the Pokémon Center, which looked pretty good. The Pokémon Center sure did have a lot of money if they were able to provide the trainers with such luxurious rooms in the Pokémon Center at a reasonably cheap price. They sure did know how to take care of Pokémon trainers, that was for sure. The various fish tanks and pools that he spotted after he entered the Cerulean City gym had astonished Ash to say the least. Not only that, but he also passed through a Hall W, which had seats that could have an audience of around a few thousand at least. He'd learned that the gym leaders were called the Sensational Sisters and held water ballet shows. They were quite popular after all. But he didn't expect all this to be in the gym. Sure, he'd expected there to be various pools, but he predicted them to have gym trainees training their Pokémon instead of girls putting on shows. Nonetheless, he ignored those things and focused solely on the gym battle that awaited him, strolling through the building to where he'd been told the gym battles took place. And when he arrived to the battle arena, what caught his interest wasn't the battlefield, which was a pool, but the 3 girls, one with indigo hair, one with golden blonde hair, and the third with pink hair, sitting near the pool. Dressed in nothing but their swimsuits. They appeared to have just had a swim as the 3 wiped their hair with towels. Ash rolled his eyes before he walked up to the 3. "Are you 3 the gym leaders here?" The 3 had noticed Ash approaching them, but they didn't do anything except for just sit there and wait for him to speak. And when he did, they all sighed. "Yes, we totally are." The blonde stood up and raised an eyebrow. "Are you like a challenger?" Ash couldn't help but purse his lips to the right at their ignorance. "Yes, I am," he replied as politely as possible. Quote, "I would like to challenge you to a battle for the Cerulean Gym badge." He announced his intentions to the 3 with confidence. The girl with violet hair looked up at him. "Sorry, but we don't have any Pokémon left to battle." Her tone didn't sound sorry at all. Instead, it almost seemed condescending. "All our Pokémon are in the Pokémon Center. If you would have come here a few hours earlier, we would have been able to battle you, but you're just too late." The third girl with pink hair shook her head, her arms folded. "I see," Ash sighed. He hadn't even thought about the possibility of a GYM challenge being denied because of the leaders not having Pokémon left to battle with. "Can you tell me when I'll be able to have a gym battle?" "Don't worry about the battle, it's fine," the blonde-haired girl said. "Seal," she called, and soon, a white Pokémon with black eyes and 2 fangs emerged from the pool. The girl took the water droplet-shaped badge that the seal held in its tongue and offered it to Ash. "You want the Cascade badge, right? Here, you can have it. You don't even need to battle us for that." Ash didn't move from his position. He was simply shocked by what the blonde girl had just told him. Gyms weren't supposed to hand trainers official gym badges without a battle. Trainers had to earn their badges, and he didn't want it any other way. He wanted the badge right now. But he would never accept a badge that was presented to him like this without a proper Pokémon battle. Thinking that Ash was confused as he hadn't responded, the pink-haired girl compelled him to accept it. "Just take it. That's a genuine Cascade badge, no strings attached. You can use it in the Pokémon League." As soon as she said that, Ash scorned at her. But Ash couldn't even put it into words. Finally, he snapped. "You call yourselves gym leaders?" he shouted, a vein popping on his forehead. That's not how it's supposed to be. I want to earn my gym badge by defeating the gym leader. But what's the difference? The indigo-haired girl asked, shrugging and putting one of her hands on her hip. You're getting what you want, so shouldn't you be thankful that you get it for free without having to work hard for it? I don't want it that way, Ash responded, shifting his glare to the girl who just said that. Look, the blonde girl began again. If you don't want to have this badge, fine. You'll have to wait for our Pokemon to recover before we can have a gym battle with you. Yes, that's what I had planned on doing. But you never answered my question. Ash rolled his eyes, letting out a sigh. This wasn't how he expected his meeting with the Cerulean City gym leaders to go. How long will it take? He asked, his tone calmer than before. About a week or so, the blonde replied after a moment of thought. All right, Ash sighed. There was nothing else he could do right now. He had to wait. Right when Ash was about to leave, someone appeared from one of the entrances. I will battle the challenger, the feminine voice declared. Ash felt as if he'd heard that voice before, and when he looked at the one whom the voice belonged to, his eyes widened. The girl who'd made that statement was one who he'd battled on Route 1. It was the girl with the Staryu that Kaiser had defeated, as he recalled. The orange-haired girl made her way to the gym leader's position on one end of the pool and removed a Pokeball. I am also one of the Cerulean gym leaders, she called out challengingly to Ash. I will give you a gym battle that you'll never forget. Ash sighed at the atrocious remarks that the girl made. Is she really one of the gym leaders? He questioned to the blonde-haired girl. The blonde nodded jovially. Well, she isn't one of the sensational sisters, but she is one of the gym leaders. You can battle her if you want. Ash nodded and walked over to the end opposite to where the girl with the weird orange ponytail stood and unclipped one of his own Pokeballs. He wasn't quite sure the level of challenge she would pose, since Kaiser had almost effortlessly beaten her Staryu. He wouldn't let his guard down, however. Lily, Violet, Daisy, the orange-haired gym lead, shouted to the three sensational sisters. One of you be the referee. Be the judge, Daisy, the indigo-haired girl told the blonde, who nodded and walked to the judge's position between the pool. This will be a 2-on-2 Cerulean City gym battle between, she turned to Ash as if asking for his name. My name's Ash Ketchum, Ash informed her. Daisy nodded and began. This will be a 2-on-TW. Cerulean City gym battle between Ash Ketchum and gym leader Misty. Only the challenger can substitute Pokemon. Begin. As soon as the last word left Daisy's mouth, both Ash and Misty tossed their Pokeballs up in the air. Out of Misty's Pokeball came out her Staryu, while Ash's Pokeball revealed Ava, who flapped her wings and flew in front of her trainer. Staryu, use water gun. Misty shouted her order. Ash countered instantly. Quick attack. Staryu jerked its top limb and a jet of water headed at Ava from the hole in the limb. Ava though proved too fast for the water gun as she slipped into quick attack, almost disappearing from sight. Leaving behind white trails, Ava slammed her body into Staryu and earned herself a cry of pain. Water gun again. Misty gritted her teeth after the Dama. Her Staryu had suffered but stuck with the same move. Ash smirked. Ava would never be hit like this. Quick attack. This was simply proving too easy for him. Like before, Staryu shot a jet of spiraling blue water at Ava. But the flying type easily evaded it before executing her quick attack and getting the same result she got last time. Quick, use rapid spin on it, Staryu. Misty shouted as she clenched her fists. That move had taken Ash and his Ava by surprise. Staryu spun around like a shuriken and tackled the bird in that state, making Ava retreat after being hit. Now, tackle, Misty yelled. Dodge it and then use wing attack, Ash commanded. Just as Staryu jumped in the air and launched itself at her, Ava unfurled her wings and headed towards the starfish Pokemon herself. Her wings gained the slightest tinge of sheen as she slammed them into the Staryu before it could complete its tackle. She just proved too fast for it. The Staryu smashed into one of the white floating beds in the pool. The red orb in its belly starting to flash red and then getting dim again. Get up, Staryu, Misty encouraged her Pokemon that had several bruises throughout its body. However, the water type got up shakily and made a smirk appear on Misty's face. We can still win this, she pointed her index finger at Ava. Psywave. At the mention of the move, Ash smirked. This Staryu knew more than just the moves he'd seen so far. However, that still wouldn't be enough to win against his Ava. This was the perfect opportunity for him to test out the move that he and his Pidgeotto had been working upon throughout their time in MT. Moon. Let's finish this, Aerial Ace. Staryu balanced itself as its body became covered outlined in a light blue glow. Meanwhile, Ava ascended and stretched out her wings as her entire form got surrounded by multiple silver streaks of energy. As the Staryu released the blue rings of psychic energy at Ava, she simply shot herself down at the Staryu. The Psy-Wave hit Ava, but it didn't take her more than a second to destroy the psychic waves with her Aerial Ace and then head straight down at Staryu. Although it was a direct hit from the Psy-Wave, Ava's Momentu M had allowed her to cut through most of the damage the attack could do, hence minimizing its effects. The starfish Pokémon grunted in pain after Ava struck it with Aerial Ace, disappearing for a millisecond before she completed her attack. Misty could only watch with bogged-out eyes as her Staryu lied without any movement. Staryu, she mumbled. Daisy, though, didn't take long to call the battle. Staryu is unable to battle, so Pidgeotto wins the first round. After she shot an angry scowl at Ash, she returned her Staryu and got out her next Pokeball. She raised the ball in front of her and AV. Eyelet Pokémon very similar to Staryu appeared. Misty chooses Starmie. Raising Ava's Pokeball, Ash recalled her and unclipped his other Pokeball. Let's make this quick, Kaiser. At first, Misty was surprised to see Ash switch his Pokémon. But when she eyed Kaiser, she understood why. She realized that Ash wanted to defeat her with his dragon, like he'd done last time. She wouldn't let that happen again though. Her Starmie was much stronger than her Staryu. Dragon Breath, Ash ordered, taking the first move this time. As she saw green energy forming inside Kaiser's mouth, Misty made her own move. Dive into the water and dodge it. Quote. Just as Kaiser fired the greenish-blue breath of his, Starmie spun around and dived into the pool, disappearing from sight. The dragon breath passed through W. Here Starmie once stood and crashed into one of the walls of the gym, destroying some of even that cemented structure. The successful dodge of her Starmie had Misty grin victoriously at Ash. However, her grin vanished when she saw that Ash had a dangerous smirk on his face. The look that he gave her almost made her feel like it had been her who was at a disadvantage in the water, not him. That's a big mistake, Ash commented. He'd planned to use the field to his advantage the moment the battle had begun. If inside water, an electric-type attack didn't need to make a direct hit for it to be successful. Shock Wave in the pool. Kaiser. The calm instruction that Ash gave to Kaiser made Misty realize her mistake. She'd walked right into Ash's trap. Water conducted electricity and that shock wave would do much more damage in water than it would outside of it. She cursed herself for forgetting about water-type Pokemon's biggest weakness in the heat of battle. Get out of there, she yelled in fright. Starmie. Although her Starmie was quick, the orange-haired gym leader could only watch in terror as the blue electricity that surrounded Kaiser's entire body was released into the pool of water. Sparks flew out of the pool as the water conducted the shock wave, making electricity reach every corner of the pool. Its cries of agony could be heard when Starmie finally emerged from the water. A few sparks crackling around her body. Misty gritted her teeth when she saw her Starmie struggle. Shake it off and use Swift. Cut it off with Dragon Breath. Ash commanded. Starmie released multiple golden stars from the red core in its body while Kaiser let out a stream of his draconic breath. The two attacks met in the middle, but both of them ran through the other, hitting their targets. Now Psy-Wave. Misty shouted the moment she saw the two attacks collide. Get out of the way and use Shock Wave. Ash yelled. Starmie was a much faster Pokémon as compared to Misty's Staryu. With He jewel in the middle of its body glowing a bright shade of red, it launched a stream of multicolored psychic waves at Kaiser. The dragon Pokémon tried to slide out of the way, but the waves followed him. He let out a cry. But that wasn't enough to deter him from shooting the thunderous beam of electricity at Starmie, who couldn't evade the electric-type attack. Ash knew that as long as Kaiser could dodge Starmie's attacks, this battle was his. Finish this with another shock wave. Starmie. Misty cried out to her Pokémon, taking another moment before she could let out a command. Jump and dodge. Even though Starmie had great speed at first, the last move had left it battered. Using his free mobility in water, Kaiser had closed the distance between himself and his foe and fired another shock wave. The attack connected with the starfish Pokémon again, and this time, it fell into the water. A few moments later, Starmie emerged on the surface with the jewel on its body glowing in multiple colors. As Misty called out to it, the evolved form of Staryu got on the white floaters, but it appeared in dire shape. Kaiser was urging to finish the battle, but Ash stopped him from doing so. He simply waited for Misty to make a move. He knew that this battle was all but won and he didn't want to injure a Pokémon more than he had to. If Misty continued to battle though, he would have no CH. OICE but to use another move, but he waited to give her a chance to call her Pokémon back. Misty looked at Ash and Kaiser in surprise. She didn't expect either of them to wait to use another attack what she learned after their previous battle. She sighed and pointed her Pokeball at Starmie, who was sucked inside. After murmuring a few words of praise to it, she walked over to Daisy and took the Cascade badge from her. Here's the Cascade badge. Misty presented the badge to Ash with a smile. The smile had surprised him. Ash didn't expect someone like Misty to genuinely smile at him. Thanks. Ash smiled back as he accepted the Cascade badge from Misty. I thought you would tell your Dratini to attack again until Starmie couldn't battle anymore, she said. Ash chuckled. I would never do that and neither would Kaiser. He informed her and her eyes widened in surprise when she saw how calm Kaiser was in Ash's arms. But I never expected you to smile at me after that look you gave me back at Route 1. It took her a couple of moments to realize how she'd acted after their battle in Route 1, but when she remembered about it, her cheeks turned red. She waved her hands frantically in front of her chest. No, she hollered frantically. I was just worried about Staryu at the time, that's all. But a grinning face of Ash brought her no relief before she eventually sighed. I understand, Ash chuckled. I guess I misunderstood you. I did too, Misty whispered, her gaze fixed at the floor. She was quite embarrassed by how she'd acted that time, and more so after realizing that Ash wasn't the guy she thought he was. Anyways, Ash started, turning himself around with Kaiser in his arms. Thanks for the badge. I will be on my way now. Misty was snapped out of her daze by Ash's words as she looked at the back of the trainer who'd already started walking. She wasn't sure if he forgave her for her behavior last time. At least, she hoped he did. Thanks for watching, guys. Hope you all are enjoyed this video. If you do, please leave a like, share and subscribe. Also don't forget to support author of this fanfic. So let's end this video here. Until then, see you in next video.